People who have gone out for a pack of cigarettes and never went back to your family? What happened after you left? Got married right out of high school. Everything was going well, but we were young and both were our first partners. Come home early one day and walked in on my wife with another man. Standard insanity ensued, followed by her begging for forgiveness, and we went to months of counseling. Everything seemed well and dandy. She seemed like a totally different woman and couldn't live without me. One day, I log into our desktop PC and her Facebook is loaded and there are multiple messages, and I had to look. I found exactly what I knew I would find. It crushed me, but I acted like nothing happened. That weekend, I packed up my favorite clothes and belongings that meant a lot to me and snuck them to the car. Sunday evening, I said, "Hey, I'm going to take the dogs to the dog park and hike for a few hours." When I left, I texted our neighbor to see if anyone showed up at the house. She replied pretty quickly that a male visitor was by very quickly. I told her goodbye and the dogs and I just drove. I had a decent savings and thought, F it, I'll start off somewhere new, and that was what I did. My ex-wife didn't even try and contact me until around lunchtime the next day. When I didn't respond, she blew me up with photos and videos of her with multiple men and about how bad of a lover I was. It effed me up, but I just kept trucking. I ended up in a smaller town where I saw someone was hiring for my trade. Years later, I remarried to the best human ever. I went home not long ago and my mom posted a picture of us at a gathering. My ex hit up my Facebook and asked if we could meet for a cup of coffee and that she would like some closure. I obviously would like as well. I have to say, for all the resentment and hatred I had towards this woman, our conversation was pleasant and I felt better after we talked. She understood why I left, and she apologized deeply, many times, and didn't try to blame me for anything. After an hour and a little bit of tears, awkward as hell in public, she asked if it was okay to get a hug. We hugged and said our goodbyes. Once I got home, I told my wife about the visit and she got awkward for a few minutes. She left the room and I didn't follow. I thought, oh, I'm sleeping on the couch tonight. 5 minutes later, she came back crying and just gave me the biggest hug ever. She told me she forgot what I went through and she was sorry and glad our life is good. Closing, I left a terrible human for the best human ever. Edit. This blew up. I'd like to thank everyone for their kind words. 1. Yes, I took the dogs. I love those dogs more than most of my family. Sadly, they've passed of old age, and I can't wait to see them again, but thank you for the kind words. 2. Yes, we got divorced. It was a pretty quick and painless process. My best friend growing up ended up being a divorce lawyer. When I took off, I called him and provided him with the photo/video evidence. It was a pretty simple process after that. So first of all, I think OP here made the absolute correct move in walking away, and my hat's off to him for even granting her closure. I think in a situation like that, if you're the perpetrator, the one that constituted the affair, you don't get closure. You know what I mean? Like, to soothe your guilty conscience. So kudos for being the bigger person there. Glad it worked out and you met someone much, much better for you. Story 2. When I was 8, I moved out from my abusive father. I was commuting to college at the time and I had morning classes. So the night before, I packed my car with as much of my stuff as I could and set off. One of my professors that I regularly talked to after class noticed that my car was full of clothes and asked if everything was okay. Over lunch, I explained my situation, and he offered to take me in. I had already made arrangements to live with my mother. After my classes for the day were over, I went home for the first time since I was a child to live with my mother. I slept on the couch for months before getting my own bed, and we didn't always have the money to eat, but we made it work. I've seen my father one time since then because he swore to me that he had changed. That night, he proceeded to get wasted and tried to put his hands on me. I haven't seen him since, and I have no regrets. Story 3. I was 10 years old when my mom and dad split up. We had been expecting it, but I didn't know that my mom had packed up suitcases for herself, my sister, and I. One day we went to school like everything was normal, and went to my mom's parents after school. It wasn't unusual for us to have dinner there, but then Mom sat us down and told us we'd be staying there for a while. Ended up being 6 years before we got our own place. I never got to go back to my bedroom again. My dad got remarried and his wife's daughter moved in and repainted my room. When I had to visit them, I slept on the couch while she slept in my room. Story 4. I still regret not being able to say goodbye to my sister 12 years ago. I said goodbye to my brother and my mom, but I was the only one who knew I would never come back. I moved 300 miles away. I've seen my brother and my mom twice since then. I haven't seen my sister since I put her down for a nap that day, before I knew I was leaving. After I left, my mom got married. My sister went to live with her grandparents. My brother chose to be homeless rather than let our mom drag him around different cities in the middle of a school year. I was able to finish school, which wouldn't have happened if I stayed. I stopped trying to accidentally walk in front of traffic or overdose on my prescriptions. Started eating food. Got basically blackmailed into seeing my mom after 6 years while my ex pretended we were together. I finally found a family that actually liked me. Met my boyfriend, friends for 8 years, together for 4. Got my own cat. Have my own apartment with bills paid early. Overall, it's been great in between my mom popping into my life. Story 5. When my parents moved to their new house, I lived there too, but after I finished school, I did a nationwide job search and wound up about 2 hours away. My cat was absolutely not a fan. Didn't like the car ride. Immediately hid under the basement couch once she got inside. I would sit on top of the couch to keep her company, and I'd occasionally slip a kibble underneath since she wasn't eating much. I watched her cautiously explore the first floor the night after the move, but most of the time was hiding. I went out of state to visit my significant other, who would say, "I can't believe you left the cat in her time of need." But when I returned, Kitty was still not confident, but was back to her usual habits in the new house. She even went upstairs to cuddle when I passed out from jet lag watching YouTube and spent the night before I went back to school. I couldn't stand the idea of making her move again after I got a job, so she stays with my parents despite me being in another city. I visit about once a month, and last night I had a dream that she was snuggling and talking to me. I woke up to my significant other snuggling me, but very passed out. The two things combined were so pure that I cried a little. Edit. The basement was her intended place to start out, since it gave her easy access to her food, etc. We opened the carrier down there after showing her where everything is, and she went right under the couch. It was the hiding bit that surprised us because when she moved into the old house as a kitten, we tried to confine her and she just jumped the barrier to explore. Story 6. Half answer. My dad died when I was pretty young. My mom eventually remarried to a pretty cool guy when I was young. He was honestly an amazing dad, and when my mom got sick when I was 12, he was absolutely incredible, taking care of everyone and reaffirming that I was his son. When my mom died, it was just me and him for a few years, and there were some amazing times. He made sure I was seeing a counselor, and we did family things on the weekend. My friends used to joke that he wasn't even my biological dad, and he still made more time for me, and did more things for me than their bio dads did. When I was 15, he got remarried. I didn't exactly like my new stepmom, but I didn't hate her. I think I just thought that the relationship wouldn't last and he'd move on to someone better. Then they got married and it was kind of weird. I did get an amazing baby brother from that. Not all bad. My dad died when I was 17, literally taken out by an undiagnosed severe allergy. My stepmom got me from school and drove me to the hospital, and when my dad passed away, she handed me my baby brother and said she needed a minute by herself. I never saw her again. She was much younger than my dad and was an ex-foster care kid with no family or best friends to support her. And I think she looked at her newborn baby and the kid her dead husband inherited and just couldn't handle it. I sure know I wasn't prepared to handle it. But my mom and my biological dad had been ex-foster care kids, and mom told me a few effed stories, so I wasn't going to let that happen to me or my brother. I do sometimes feel a little resentful that I can't have the normal life. I'm working too much, and I have a 6-year-old to figure out, to consider college, but I don't want my family to just be cycles of poverty and dead-end jobs. Edit. Wow, guys, I'm touched by the response. I have full custody. My stepdad adopted me when my mom died, so for all intents and purposes, my brother is legally my brother. Afraid I can't give too many details. I want to adopt him, and there's a court case or two that I don't want to compromise just in case. Movies have told me that anyway. Stepmom will probably be charged with abandonment when she can be located, but so far we haven't heard anything. I've always been worried that she had a mental health break and either unalived herself. I used to call up locally and ask for Jane Does that fit her. Hey, coping mechanisms, am I right? Or she's had a mental health break and something snapped. Abandonment didn't really fit what I knew of her, and I remember that she had some kind of mental health problems. It's not like we talked about it, though. She could have gone off her meds in the chaos and snapped. I'm more worried than angry, but my first concern will always be for my favorite little tyke. We're doing pretty well. We have a support worker who's been fantastic, helping us get access to free and reduced cost services. I'm also pretty thrifty. I YouTubed how to knit socks and fix clothing, and thrift stores are great. I don't live near a major city, and so it's not as expensive as it could have been. Being frugal also helps. There's usually always good stuff out there if you know how to ask for help, and my dad always told me the hardest thing but the most important thing to do was to suck up your pride and ask for help. I'm getting better about that, but it's hard. My dad making me do therapy helped a bunch to admit when I needed help. He said that needing help wasn't about being capable, but about being smart. that if you're carrying an expensive TV, you could carry it by yourself, but you're smarter if you grab a friend. I'm almost finished with an apprenticeship right now, and I'm in a union that's decent enough that wives used to drop off casseroles and leave cribs and stuff on our porch. Everyone should be involved in their community. I wouldn't have survived without everyone willing to go to bat for me. I'm working pretty hard because I'm incredibly fortunate that I met good people along the way. I owe them a lot. I also work part-time at a nursery, helping with plants and stuff on weekends for the staff discount and free stuff. I've taken home more than a few half-dead fruit trees and vegetable seedings. The more I work, the more I can throw into savings. It's morbid, but I want to make sure if I die, he's not financially worrying about paying for that. It's not exactly a good feeling. My bro and I have been working on expanding our tiny garden to try and offset the cost of food, and he seems to like gardening just as much as my dad did. Last year, we didn't buy a single potato or any herbs. It's been the best low-cost, high-involved activity we're doing, and it sometimes makes me feel less guilty that I can't be there more for him, like our dad was for me. We have glass pasta jars and tin cans growing basil and rosemary right now. I told my bro if he can keep them alive all year without me needing to intervene, we can look at adopting chickens. He specifically wants 2 chickens named Chick Ken and Chick Barbie because he's funnier than I am. I'm working a bunch now because I want him to be in a better position in the future. My dad left a small but decent amount in a trust, and I pulled from it when I first got custody when I was scrambling to afford everything. I want to replace everything I took, and also make sure he can afford to do things that I couldn't when growing up. When he's in high school and wants to celebrate by going to Mexico, then he's going to Mexico. I do miss the stuff I can't do. I've never not had responsibilities. I'm still friends with people from school, and they're doing cross-country adventures and dropping money on expensive stuff. It's such a weird idea that they can just go to music festivals without worrying about anything, while I'm trying to find a detergent that doesn't set the bros' eczema off. Wouldn't trade him for the world, though. We have savings accounts and insurance policies, and I'm probably better off than a lot of people. The comments have been incredible, with people offering help from everywhere. I needed that help when I was 17 and scared out of my absolute mind. I'm almost 24 now and I'm stable, but paranoid and weird for sure. If you'd like to donate, please direct them to local organizations fighting the good fight. The difficult part of the story is basically over. Until he hits teenage years, probably. God knows how I'm going to handle that. That's a problem for future me. I don't need that kind of help anymore, and I'm moving into the phase of life where I just want to give back to people that have helped me by passing it on. I joined Reddit because I saw that post that said, "Today you, tomorrow me." That's my philosophy in life. There are a lot of people out there like me, and they deserve to be able to grow garlic and old jams with their family just as much as I did. So I can't not comment on this one. Like, wow, what a powerful story. It just goes to show you that family isn't necessarily bonded by blood. It's what you make of it, who you choose to be your family. And so for these two brothers to have this connection that aren't even related by blood, technically, it's very powerful. And I appreciate OP sharing this story. I mean, this is something that like you get up and you tell at a graduation speech or something like that. It's that powerful. So definitely rooting for you two. You're going to be great because you have the right attitude. Story 7. Growing up, my mother was pretty abusive, mostly emotional, to me and my little sister. This included basically fabricating a false reality that my dad had divorced my mother and left her penniless, then left the state, as well as isolating us from other family members on the basis that they were bad people. Probably the worst thing she did, which I still deal with today, was turning me and my little sister against each other in these effed up scenarios. Basically, her drug and her alcohol-induced rage of the day would always fall on one of us. However, whoever told on the other sibling that they did something to anger my mother would face her wrath, and the other sibling would have a brief respite. This went on since I was 8 or so. I grew up hating my sister. After I got older, I found my best friend in high school, and he helped me understand just how effed up my situation was, that I assumed that's how family life was since we were so isolated, no TV or internet, and that my mother was also a teacher at both my elementary and middle school. She had control over everything. At 18, I left my house and moved in with my friend. However, it wasn't forever. He was joining the army at the end of school, and I had to think of someone to stay with. So I found my dad, states away. I took a long shot and asked him if I could stay with him. He accepted. I got everything I owned in the world, which fit in a truck bed, and while most kids were going off to college, I was going to start over in a completely different place with a father I didn't know. It turned out my dad was a decent guy. He wasn't a saint by any means, but leagues better than my mother. He helped me get a driver's license and eventually helped me join the military, where I've just finished my first year in. I haven't seen my little sis in 2 years though, and she still hates me. Even though she's 18, she hasn't left her mother, and since I left, she's become closer with her. I regret not trying harder to be there for her every day. But as for my life now, I have 3 years left in the military, then I hope to go to college and become a pilot. None of which I ever thought of when I was living under my mother's roof. Story 8. My ex-husband was extremely physically and emotionally abusive, as well as an alcoholic/addict. He obsessively controlled the money in every second of my daily routine. An unplanned 5-minute delay to get gas on the way home would result in a dressing down, if I was lucky, a beating if I wasn't. We had 3 daughters, and on the few occasions I threatened to leave, he'd tell me to go ahead and leave, but I couldn't take our daughters with me. At one of our couple friends' wedding reception, he got drunk as per usual and lost his mind over something insignificant, dragged me around in the street by my hair, and pulled a gun on me in front of the wedding party. One of his friends, who was a real POS, took me aside while the groom's mom was driving my ex home and told me, "You don't have to live like this." It was like a light went off in my mind. This guy says I don't have to live like this? It took me a couple of weeks to put a plan in place, but one morning after my ex left for work, my dad helped me pack everything that would fit in a U-Haul, and I GTFO. I'd like to say I never saw him again after that day, but I was pretty lucky he decided to leave me alone after an initial period of stalking and about in jail for violating an order of protection. Fast forward 15 years, and I finished undergrad, law school, and postdoc. I'm remarried with 2 more amazing kids, and life is pretty much goals. Edit. I forgot to mention the kids. I did take them with me. That was why I left the way I did, since I knew he wouldn't let me leave with them otherwise. Unfortunately, it's not been all sunshine and rainbows since, although we had some pretty wonderful times over the years. My ex passed on to the girls a genetic predisposition to serious mental illness, and I lost one daughter to self-unaliving when she was 14. We all were, and are, pretty traumatized, but we cope the best we can and try to appreciate all the other wonderful things life has brought us. Story 9. My real dad ghosted like 4 families. His first family, he had a son. He was in that family for 13 years. His son had a motorcycle wreck and ended up in intensive care. A year later, he ghosted that family and moved to a new state. Just up and left. Didn't take anything but his clothes and his car. Second family, he had a daughter. He left almost immediately. Then he moved to another state and married another woman and had 2 more kids whom I've never met or spoken to. Don't even know their names, to be honest. Jake? John? Jordan? Josh? Something with a J. He went out for a pack of smokes and never went back. His own words. Then he met my mom and had my sister first. He ghosted my mom 3.2 years later, then showed up for some quick whoopee, and I happened. He ghosted her, but didn't leave the state. She called the cops, and my first memory is of the cops bringing my dad to the house in cuffs and letting him go, only for him to attack my mom while she was holding me and she dropped me. Then the cops arrested him. He wanted out, he got out. He had 2 more marriages, but no kids. It's his MO to shack up with well-off women and mooch until they either kick him out or he gets bored. It's really effing painful to see, because I want to be an ass-wiping dad who's there for his kids every effing second of their lives. I want to be the exact opposite of him. Story 10. E.T. say, thank you everyone for all the kind words and support and awards. I felt a lot of love reading it all today. My mom just all of a sudden wasn't there anymore. She and my dad were miserable, but my dad wouldn't agree to divorce. He was a minister at a big church and didn't believe divorce was right, and so instead, he tried to stay married to my mom, all while avoiding her and all the unhappiness at home. She never really left her bedroom. She was miserable, and she made everyone else miserable too. She was horrible to me in those last few years. We had been really close before that. She started moving stuff out of the house, little by little when no one was home. Like, one day a bookshelf would be gone, and we'd all notice but just kind of go on with our lives. And it bothers me very, very much, but her moving out was so abrupt and so ambiguous that I don't remember specifics about it. Like, I don't know if it was during the school year or over summer. I don't know where I was or what was different when I came home that day, but at some point, she didn't live there anymore. I was 14. My dad told me that God told him she would never come back. I looked up to my dad a lot. He was kind of on the same level as God in my mind, so I believed him. He soon after started dating another woman, secretly because the church didn't know he was divorced yet. He intended to marry her as soon as possible. I remember I had to pose for family photos with this new woman and her 2 kids. They were printed up and put into a frame and hung over our fireplace. Then one day, my mom came to the house. She told me she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she loved me and my brother and my dad, and she wanted to work everything out. I guess God was wrong when he spoke to my dad. Then she walked out of my room and saw the new family portrait over the fireplace. She left quickly. A few days later, she called the house. My dad answered, and she told him to, quote, "Tell the kids I said goodbye." Then she hung up. We started calling everyone we could think to call. We tried to call the phone operator, asking if they could trace the call. This was 1995, so no caller ID or cell phone with a callback number. A bit later that night, my new stepmom-to-be came over and pulled my dad aside. She saw a car at the end of our neighborhood that looked like my mom's. My dad called 911. Everyone showed up. My mom had taken a bucket of pills. She was barely alive. They took her to the ER and pumped her stomach and intubated her. They told my dad to call my brother so he could come say his goodbyes too. I was let into the room for a while. I looked at the machines and they were plugged into the wall, and I stared for a long time, thinking I should unplug it because she really didn't want to be revived, and I couldn't understand why we were doing all this. But then a nurse came in and said I had to leave while they did stuff. My mom survived. My dad married the other lady. I think this messed me up, and I honestly can't believe I've typed up this entire recollection. I don't think about it very often, and maybe that's why I can't remember the details of the day I realized she'd moved out. Story 11. I hadn't started a family of my own yet, but I was engaged to my ex, who I just ended up ghosting after a few years. It was several years ago, and he had to move back to Tokyo for his job. We met in the US while he was an expat, so he asked me to come live with him. Moved, met the family, all that stuff. Then one day, I came down with the flu and was miserable and was so weak I couldn't even walk myself to the toilet. He was trying to come on to me several times that day, and I kept refusing because of obvious reasons. Then I was in the middle of sleeping, and he started to take off my clothes and have sex with me while I was sleeping after already refusing it to him. I woke up and was like, WTF, and made him stop. Then I pretended to be asleep till he left for work the next morning, packed my crap and left, dropped the key off at concierge and hurried out of that building in a huge panic. Never spoke to him again, cut off all contact immediately. I booked hotels for a couple of weeks and met my now husband. So normally I wouldn't condone ghosting, but if you're getting essayed in your sleep like that, that's absolutely grounds to break off an engagement, a marriage, whatever you guys are to each other, and get the hell out of there. So good on you. Story 12. Didn't leave my wife and kids as I don't have any, but I did walk out on my mother and siblings without any notice. Dad was not in the picture. After? Best decision of my life. My mother refuses treatment for her very serious mental illness or illnesses and was incredibly abusive physically as well as neglectful while I was growing up. I saw the effect it had, burned out other siblings with no motive or drive, and instead embraced the crazy just to feel sane in the toxic family home we lived in. I was homeless for about a year and a half, living out of a duffel and bumming food from friends. I feel like my life hasn't even started until I left it behind. I feel like it held me back for 17 years, and I now am finally able to find out who I am. Mom never came looking for me. I reconnected with my estranged father, whom I learned was in the military from the moment he was 18 until he was HD at 43. He has severe PTSD from his 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now getting his master's in outdoor leadership, which I believe is a perfect way to use his massive skill set. I don't see him much, if ever, but at least I know some blood is still thicker than water. Story 13. When I was 5, my dad came home from work, and my mom informed him, completely out of the blue, that she wanted an immediate divorce. I found out many years later she'd had an affair and was pregnant. He moved out of the house. They had 3 little kids together. I was the oldest. And she married her second husband. Twice. They weren't divorced the first time. He was paying child support as he was supposed to, but she was calling him at work and sending him letters at home. His sister kept them, asking for more, and he began to get complaints about it from his bosses. He asked his mother what he should do. She advised him to tell her he was giving her all he could and all he was ordered to, and that he was going to lose his job if she kept it up, and that if she didn't stop, he'd leave the state and she'd never hear from him again. She thought that would make her wise up and leave him alone. So he did, but she continued. so he asked his mother for advice again. Her advice was to follow through, and so he did. He packed his clothes into his car and headed for Canada. He got as far as 2 states north from where he began, liked a little town he came across, and got a job there. I never forgot him. I was the only one of the 3 of us kids that had any memories of him. But when I was 16 and moved away from my extremely abusive home in every way, I called my aunt, whose name I knew, who happened to live in the town I was also then living in, and told her I wanted to meet him. Coincidentally, he happened to be visiting her. I met him, my aunt, my grandfather, and my grandmother while he was there. It turned out to be the only time I would ever meet my grandfather. He died 2 years later, but I will never ever forget it. He wrapped me up in a big, strong bear hug, told me how beautiful I was, how much he loved me, and how much he'd always loved me, and how very, very happy he was to see me again after all these years. I cried then, and I'm crying again now, writing it down. I can still feel the love and caring in his arms. I wasn't ready to get to know my dad at 16, though. I realized that I just wanted to see him. It took me another 10 years before I contacted him again, but I did when I was living in California. And when I did, he took 2 weeks vacation, so did I, drove down to see me, and we spent the entire 2 weeks getting to know one another. And once he left, we were in contact daily. I had quit my job and moved up to the P&W a month later because I knew the hole in my heart would never be filled until my dad was a part of my life, and I was correct. My son has a grandpa because of my decision, and my dad is the greatest grandpa there is. I wish he'd have always been in my life, but the outcome I received is worth everything I've been through. I love you, Dad. Story 14. 5 years ago, I moved in with my then girlfriend. First time living with someone I dated and first relationship in a very long time. She turned out to be a nightmare. She had 2 boys, 4 and 5, and their father died of a drug overdose on their couch less than a year prior. I did not know this moving in, and the boys found him. She was also bat crap crazy and was a pretty bad pillhead and smoked crack up until a few months before I met her. I moved in with her way too soon because I didn't feel like paying rent for my apartment when I was never there. Big mistake. I bought a truck from her parents and was making payments on it, and we put it in both our names so I could go on her insurance. I used to leave for work at 4 a.m. and sometimes wouldn't be home until 9 to 10 p.m., hour-plus drive, and by the time I'd get home, she'd usually be plastered drunk, like a bottle of whiskey deep, and would just berate me the second I got home. If I said anything wrong to her, she would flip her crap and threaten to take my name off the truck title that she hid from me and report it stolen and crap like that. One day, I had enough. I called my boss and told him I needed to GTFO of there and needed the day off. I waited until she left for work and moved all my stuff out to a friend's house in an RV he had on his property, went to the DMV and filed for a lost title and got a new one just in my name. Got new insurance, changed my phone number, and rented a hotel room for 2 weeks far away from her, but much closer to my job. I had a few thousand saved up and used almost all of it to get away from her. She never effing saw it coming. Always told me I was too much of a coward to actually do anything about how she treated me. Oh, and I never paid for the truck. Kind of a dick move to do to her parents, but at the time, I needed to put as much space between her and I as possible. Oh yeah, and she told me she talked to her psychic, one of those bullcrap phone psychics, and they told her to tell me to spend as much time with my mother as possible because I didn't have much time with her left. My mom had just found out she had terminal cancer and only about a year left to live if she was lucky. If I hadn't completely cut this psycho female dog out of my life, I was going to do something very stupid and likely spend a long time in prison. Only thing I feel bad about is ghosting on her 2 boys. They looked up to me as a father figure and adored me, especially because their mom was horribly abusive to them. She would cuss at them like they were adults and would constantly brag about how her sister worked for Child Protective Services, so she knew how to abuse them without breaking the law. Things like using distilled vinegar to wash their mouths out instead of soap because it wasn't child abuse because it's technically a food product or other crazy crap. Year of my life I regret, but it made me a lot more cautious about relationships. I'm now engaged to the love of my life and have gotten sober, and my personal and family life is doing nothing but getting better every day. Still though, F that crazy idiot. Story 15. Mine was I'm going to the gas station. I'm in an interfaith and interracial relationship, and my family never ever accepted it. It escalated to physical violence and I needed to make an exit. I let my mom know I wanted to marry him. She told me I could stay and be less than the dirt under her shoe, or I could go. I left. It's been 3 years. I went back once to get my clothes, but haven't been back. It's been super trying. They still have some contact with me, but refuse to accept my one and only boundary. Show me that you can even effing acknowledge my fiance, and then we can start rebuilding. Ultimately, I had to walk away from a place where I was being punished for not doing my duty as a daughter, which is putting my happiness second to the respect of the family name. This was the first time in my life I ever truly wanted something just for me, and they couldn't handle it. So now they're stuck in a place where I'm the bad guy, and I'll always be the bad guy because to them, I should be falling over myself to get my moms to forgive me, and I just don't. It's really opened my eyes to how toxic my family actually is, and how conservatively I was being raised. My biggest sadness is that my brothers, who I loved very dearly, cannot fathom going against my mom. But I'm a better and healthier person now, and I would never go back, even if you told me I would love a normal life with all my family talking to me. Edit. Hi everyone. First, thank you for all the interest in my situation, and all of your kind comments. I haven't had a chance to reply yet because I've been at work, but I wanted to clarify some things, since I keep seeing similar questions. 1. I meant mom, not moms. My bad. And 2, I'm Arab and Muslim, and my fiance is Catholic and Polish American. I did not initially say what our faiths or ethnicities were because I didn't think it mattered a ton, and I didn't want the comments to skew into a Muslim hate fest, if I'm honest, especially because I do still practice my religion, just perhaps not to the level my family would want me to. I know from looking online for guidance that lots of families won't accept their child's SO for what are frankly dumb reasons. Gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whatever. All of these reasons are bullcrap. Accept that your kid will make decisions for themselves, and remember that ultimately they don't live for you. 3. Fiance is somewhere down below also responding, in case you want his perspective on the whole thing. 4. Fiance and I met like anyone else. He was actually the brother of my college friend. We chatted online for a while and we made it official. I think the only real difference is that I had to make a really big decision early in our relationship. I understood the potential consequences, but it was all worth it. It was by no means easy though. What you're reading now is about 3 years worth of dedication and trust in each other. So I completely agree with everything that's being said here. It's not necessarily, well no, it's not at all, the parents' or family's place to set parameters for who their child can date. As soon as they're adults, they can make whatever decision they want. They can date whoever they want, marry whoever they want. You're certainly welcome to your opinions, right? Free speech and all of that. But as far as trying to actively blackmail and extort your kids, that's screwed up. So I'm glad that she followed her heart, did what she wanted to do anyway. And, she's happy as of the time of this post. So good for you. Story 16. Fled town to live with a PTSD-riddled vet, a conspiracy theorist, an addict, a TLC-level hoarder, and their skittish German shepherd. Tried to go to school and was denied the FAFSA. Took a $7.25 an hour job to make ends meet and hit a wall in life for the next 2 years. Lost a crap ton of weight. Moved out to live by the beach in Florida. Got in some trouble down there. Worked 3 $8 an hour jobs. Had some run-ins with the cops. Slept on an air mattress in the kids' room and shared a bathroom with 14 people. Moved to a college town. Tried to go to school again and was denied a second time. Made some buddies. Lived as a college kid despite not being enrolled. Met my most notorious ex. Wandered around directionless. Lived up north for 3 months. Moved to the city. Gave up on attempting college after being denied a third time. Took a soul-crushing job. Attempted self-unaliving. Gained 45 pounds. Binge ate. Isolated myself. Nasty breakup. Mudslinging. Potential lawsuit. Still dealing with that. Unemployed. Haunted house. Accused of effing my roommate's boyfriend. Kicked out. Lived in the projects. Chased by crackheads. Attacked by a dog. Still have the puncture marks on my left thigh. Searched for another place to live for 6 months. No luck. Worked at a gym for $10. Turned 22. Felt 68. Fled the projects, lived with a single mother, an undocumented immigrant, a Wiccan, a prostitute, a neglected dog, 11 cats, and our landlord all in one house. Rehomed the dog out from under the landlord's nose. Wiccan tried to kill me and the single mom twice. Wiccan later decided she liked me and decided to recruit me onto SA. Everyone hated the Wiccan. Everyone moved out. Wiccan brings sugar daddies into our rooms at all hours of the night. Time to split. Lived in car. 35 degrees. Horrific existence. Contemplated self-unaliving. Kept my situation a secret from everyone but my best friend. Woke up frostbitten and numb. Gained another 20 pounds. Continued working at the gym. Lied to my grandma so she wouldn't keel over before I could see her one last time. Spent 3 months searching for a place. No luck. Find an ad on Craigslist. Meet up with the girl in question. Lots in common. Much good. I move in. Make friends with cuddly cats. No more frostbite. Girl tells me I can stay. Pay raise at my job, then promotion, then transfer all in the next 4 months. Still sad days sometimes, but have roof, pool, 2 steady jobs, friend, and kidders. 10 out of 10. Yeah, so if there's ever a lesson to never give up on life and keep trudging along, things will turn around, assuming that all of this is accurate and true, yeah, way to persevere. Glad that despite going through all that, you rate your life a 10 out of 10. Good for you. Story 17. Not married or with kids, but siblings and parents, thus everyone else in the family. But I parked my car 2 blocks over, told my neighbors I had someone stalking me that would tell them they were my family, and spent about an emergency month finding a new city to live in, then doing the move for my stuff to the U-Haul at 2 a.m. I regret the 2 a.m. move. I'm sure it wasn't quiet. I liked and tried to respect my neighbors, even now, and lying to them was effed up, but it was more acceptable than asking them to lie for me to the face of my ex-family that were trying to track me down. They'd know if my neighbors were lying, that something was up, to keep nosing about. I seriously don't know what happened next. I never want to inquire to find out. They have money to hire a private investigator. They would. I don't want to make it easier for them by showing back up in the same old places I was before to see what happened in the aftermath with them. First thing I did landing here was introduce myself to the neighbors, get on a first-name basis like I always did before this ever had to happen. Good to be respected in the neighborhood. Even better to have people who'll tell you if someone is nosing about. I'm probably out of the will, and out of almost $1 million of inheritance, but F that. Happiness, security, and lack of paranoia is worth it. Story 18. I tried to a few times, obviously unsuccessfully, as I went back, but not of my own volition, so I'm not entirely sure if this counts. I was legally an adult at the times of these incidents, and do have diagnosed issues mentally now, most of them stemming from my abusive mother. 1. She had been yelling and yelling and yelling for hours about my issues remembering things. 2 hours, to be exact, from 10 p.m. to just a little after 12 a.m. When she finally stopped, I just walked out of the house and intended to keep going, telling her I was going for a walk. She ran outside and started grabbing at me and eventually threatened to kill my fish by flushing them to get me home. 2. A similar incident occurred, her yelling at me for hours, chasing me into my room, forcing the door open, and forcing me to let her continue to yell at me while I struggled to breathe. I had no fish this time, but I had my dog, my goodest boy. I leashed him. She tried yanking the leash out of my hands and threatened to have him killed. He was a puppy at the time. I grabbed him and hurried out into the rain, and she sent my brothers after me. They kept following me, and I couldn't get away as I can't run. Deformed bone in my leg. Eventually, they cornered me near a phone and got my aunt to come get me. 3. I'm not sure if I was going to actually leave this time, but I wanted to be anywhere than at my aunt's house. She and my other aunt started to lace into me for not sitting straight and ladylike and for wearing men's clothes. I'm FTM, but they would murder me if they found out. I want so bad to get away and transition and live my life in peace. This again went on for hours, and I had enough. I grabbed my coat and left, telling them that I was just going home. In broad daylight at a busy corner, they caught up to me and grabbed me by my coat and hair. I was screaming for them to let me go, looking at other people for help as I was physically dragged back to my aunt's apartment. Nobody helped. I was dragged backed into a corner at her place and cried and screamed and tried to get out again until I had no energy to fight anymore. I remember curling into a ball while shaking and struggling to breathe, with them grabbing my arms and hair to try and force me up. They were still yelling for a long while. Nobody called the police. I'm on my meds now, but they don't understand that I'll keep having panic attacks in these situations. It still feels like I gave up. Just getting to the end of this hurts. I'm trying to leave again with my social worker's help, but my mom keeps foiling every single attempt at leaving. Story 19. Warning for everyone who's sensitive to self-unaliving. I only know one story about this kind of thing, and it was my dad's best childhood friend. He was I don't know if you still call it that after that long, recovering drug addict. He was addicted to cocaine when he was in his teens to early 20s, 30-ish years ago, and back then lost a lot of money due to gambling and hookers. He got into a relationship with a woman back then who was supporting his bad habits and exploiting him for money, but he turned his life back around, left her, gave up his addiction, moved away for some time, found a wife, and got a family. But the drugs and debt left a scar and he became depressed, which I didn't know till after he died. As long as I've known him, he was always a happy person. He and my dad have known each other since what Americans would call high school. My dad supported him in his worst times and vice versa. Apparently, he sought counseling the last year and got better for a time, but went into a strong depression a few weeks before the incident. My dad told me that the drugs left a big dent in him and he heard voices telling him to do bad stuff for quite some time. But he told his wife it had stopped and even stopped going to counseling after getting better for like 5 days. His last day, he was at my dad's house. Before, he told his wife and daughter that he'd visit my dad. Wasn't an unregular action. They'd hang out quite often. And there he was, happy as always. They even made plans for the next day to go to a sauna when he left. But on his way home, he just parked his car next to the road and jumped off a bridge onto a street below. They said it was probably planned beforehand and he just came over to say goodbye. I've only seen my father cry twice, but this one was the worst. He became completely unfunctional for a week, didn't go to work and stayed at home. His death affected my dad more than anything I've ever seen. I know this sounds cliche, but if you have any form of depression, seek help and don't let go of it. They tell you what drugs can do to you physically, but not what they might do to you mentally almost 20 years after you stopped with them. I have no idea what depression feels like, and I can't imagine what it must be like when your own brain tries to kill you / hallucinating stuff, and I'm very glad for it every day. But I know if someone came to me asking for help, I'd do anything in my power to help them. Because no one should have to go through that kind of stuff. Again, I don't really know anything about what depression feels like, but I know what it can do to everyone involved. So getting any help is better than letting it take over. But saying that is probably harder than doing that. Story 20. I was 14 and literally went out for a pack of smokes. I was visiting my estranged dad and his newest family in another state. I was meant to live there as my mom pawned me that way since she was a pill-popping alcoholic at the time. I didn't know that he hadn't been in my life for years. When I got there, I was really excited to visit and hang out, but he immediately tried to dictate me without any remorse for being gone or getting to know me again. I wasn't having any of that, so he slapped me across the face. They passed out and I headed out for smokes. I had quit prior to, but decided to start up again. 3 miles later in Hickville, I got my smokes. I ended up hitchhiking back and they were just waking from a nap. I told him I didn't want to stay, so he later dropped me off at the nearest Greyhound without any words. Fast forward to 20 years later. He had a massive stroke and was just diagnosed with dementia, so he couldn't talk much. He could say yeah and a few things. I hadn't spoken to him this entire time, so I drove and flew for 36 hours to spend 12 hours with him. I was sitting next to his bedside and it was quiet. That's when I told him I forgive him. I knew it was the last time I'd see him. He wanted to say something but couldn't. He cried and said, "Yeah." I just replied, I know. I'm your favorite child." We laughed super hard. He died a year later, in 2015. Sometimes closure isn't for them, it's for you. Story 21. I'm here to offer a counterpoint. Here's a pack of cigarettes that actually had a happy ending. Kind of. My family is literally still at the wedding where we discovered this, so processing it is still weird. Sorry if it doesn't quite match the Rex. It wasn't my dad, and it didn't quite happen overnight. My granddad disappeared when my mom was a teenager. He'd migrated to be with my grandma, but never really found a stable job for most of his life. Nobody knew where he went for most of the 80s, but we could kind of guess. He'd left behind a small farm in the old country, so he started making weekly trips across the border, and one day he never came back, so the stories go. My grandma got left behind to bring up both the kids, me, mom, and uncle, on a nurse's salary for something like a decade. Apart from people calling to collect debts, nobody knew anything until my granddad pulled a Rick Sanchez and showed up on the doorstep again in the early 90s. My grandmother was a very devout Christian, so she let him back into the home without any trouble. No speaking terms. Cut to the picture when I was growing up. Raising 2 teenagers as a single mother had made my grandmother a hard, angry woman. My grandfather, by contrast, was a cheery, easygoing bum whose neighborhood drank beer with him. My grandmother was respected, but my grandfather was more liked by far. As grandkids, we'd usually ask our gram why she couldn't be more like Grandpa. We didn't know. Also, kids are dicks. Later on, we learned about the disappearance. There's always been this incongruity between Grandpa, as the kids knew him, and the dirtbag who ditched his family for a decade. We invented stories as we went. We pretended he'd been a spy fighting the communists in the old country. My mother thought he had an undisclosed set of half-siblings. The truth didn't come out until a few nights ago. So we're all back in the old country at a cousin's wedding. My grandfather and grandmother sit at the honored table, and the story comes out. It turns out my grandfather had another family after all, his brothers. Both my grandfather's brothers died in the early 80s. He was back on the farm taking care of both their widows, running the farm, and putting his nephews and nieces, including the bride's father, through school. He only came back in the 90s once it was clear they were going to make it. My folks still can't quite process it. My grandmother could have used the money growing up. If she'd known where the money was, she probably would have divorced him. But somehow, both households have been held together, and it's really hard to begrudge my grandfather for his decision. Between one family and the other, he had to be a saint to one and scumbag to the other. How do you make sense of that? So this is definitely a noble cause for him to leave for a while. However, I don't understand why he had to completely disappear and go no contact for that long. You have to communicate. You can't just lead people to believe that you might not even be alive anymore. So I see both sides of it, but it's in the past. They're back together now, so good for them. Story 22. I did, and most days I don't regret it. My parents divorced when I was young, and I never really had any contact with my father. My mother was emotionally abusive growing up and never failed to say I was overweight or a failure. My stepfather was always super strict, and we simply never got along. The summer after I graduated from high school, my stepfather lost his job. This caused my mother to go into a downward spiral, causing her to starve herself and constantly scream at the people around her. My stepdad always came up with reasons to not be home, and they almost divorced over it. My mother took $800 from my own paychecks to help pay the bills without my permission. After she did that, I finally had enough. The day I got a new job where I knew I could afford to live on my own, I got the hell out within a couple days. I moved all my own stuff out of their house and never looked back. It probably drove my mother off the edge, but I don't regret doing it at all. Fast forward to now. They ended up moving to a new state, and I don't talk to any of them. The whole situation has caused my brothers and sister to not want to talk to me, but I understand. I still struggle terribly, having anxiety attacks and sprouts of depression often. It's hard not having any family to talk to when things get rough, but I would never have it any other way. Story 23. I moved 200 miles away and started a new life with my SO. I couldn't stay in that hellhole with my mother. She was an abusive addict and was slowly tearing our family apart. The mental abuse had gotten so bad that I wished for death every day. I had hoped by leaving she would see the errors of her ways and have a change of heart if she ever wanted to see her son again. Meanwhile, I started a full-time job. I work on the house from time to time, and I enjoy a variety of hobbies. I just talked to my mother today. Nothing has changed. She blames me for everything, and she still gambles while watching the family house foreclose before her eyes. It's a sad reality, but was completely necessary if I wanted to live. My only regret is not getting my dog. She lives in squalor, and it makes me so sad. Edit. Thanks for all the replies, except the one calling me a coward. The only issue with getting the dog back is that she also stunted his social growth, so he tends to be quite vicious towards anyone, including myself. I wanted to have him brought to a shelter in town since all of them are no-kill, but they all refused. My mother refused to give him up. I really wanted to avoid calling the cops on her for this issue, thinking I could reconcile with her, but after yesterday's phone call, I might have to make a decision to report abuse. My fear is that the dog will be put down, but at least he won't suffer anymore under her control. I also forgot to mention that she's the only caretaker of my elderly father. He's demented and can get quite temperamental without her. I really just wanted to avoid getting her in any trouble and hope that this would all go away. Story 24. This isn't exactly what you had in mind. When my grandfather was in hospice, I flew home to be by his side until the end. He and his wife were my everything, and I have them to thank for so much of the good in my life. My grandmother was out of state for another funeral when I arrived, and I endeavored to stay by his side until she arrived. For those of you who haven't thankfully had to deal with this, sometimes hospice is a nightmare experience. My grandfather was dying, in pain and scared. He was alone and unable to communicate. His sunken eyes were all he could use to communicate his fleeting moments of cognizance. What he could convey were moments of fear, pain, and helplessness. I never witnessed that primal expression of helplessness in giving all you have left to convey some type of connection to let out some of what you're feeling. The man who helped raise me was there before me, grasping for connection and comfort. I told him I'd remain there with him. I held him. I gave him water when he needed. I soothed him that I would make sure I'd never leave his side and he'd never need to be scared. I promised him we'd catch another baseball game together. I let him know how much I loved him. My grandmother arrived back and came to his side. I told him I'd be right back, that I'd return and stay with him until the end. I said I'd be there and we would talk more. This was 4 years ago, and not a day goes by that it doesn't eat away at me that I never returned. I wish I had a good story, a compelling reason that brings this full circle. The truth is, I let a family member bully me away. I'll never forgive myself for being so weak. I love you, Bob. Story 25. It's so funny to see this post because I did this exact thing to my ex-girlfriend in 2013. We had been together for 1 year and she had 2 kids, not mine. We lived basically in poverty in a super crappy neighborhood in a super crappy city. All she ever did was whine and female dog, and she was so lazy, never cleaned up after herself and taught her kids how. So one night I did exactly that. I was effing broke and really owned nothing except my crappy 2003 Eclipse and my clothes. I did in fact tell her I was going to get a pack of cigs, and that was the plan. But it was a nice night, so I just kinda kept driving and thinking and thinking. F going back there. I gotta do what I gotta do to keep my mental health in check because that environment was doing a serious number on me and I was becoming an alcoholic. I fought with myself pretty hard because the kids did like me and trust me, and I do still feel guilty about it today. But again, I just had to effing do it. I turned my phone off and just kept driving. I had like $100 to my name and a pair of clothes in my backpack. Drove to a new city in the same state, applied to a crap ton of jobs, used a random apartment address for my applications, got an okay job, slept in my car for a month to save up 2 checks, and showered at a truck stop. But effing made it. Rented a room in someone's apartment for only $400 a month. When I turned my phone back on the following day, I had, as expected, numerous texts. Started as just question marks, then she seemed to get pissed, then worried. I texted that I was sorry, but I'm not coming back. Then I got rid of that crappy Go phone and got a new regular phone. Doing well now. I'm assuming she's doing okay. Not too sure. We have no mutual friends and I haven't tried to contact her. Story 26. The backstory is that my mom was really controlling and possessive, and I had to get away. I called the police on her after one night that was particularly intense, and after recording a bunch of audio of what she was doing. She stayed one night in jail, and I moved in with an aunt's house who lived 2 blocks away. I stayed there for about 6 months, but they were alcoholics, and it was very, very hard on me, even worse than with my mom. So after months and months of sad posting on Facebook, and by Facebook I mean all my friends were from groups and no IRLs, someone who lived about 3 hours away and in another state contacted me and asked me what was up. We'd never talked before, but they said I could stay with them for a while. We came up with a plan, and by the end of the week, I frickin' left without a word. I left in the middle of the night, gave no context. My uncle did see me leave because he woke up and haphazardly tried to grab my suitcase, but he didn't say anything and he just kinda gave me a knowing look. And then I was frickin' gone. I stayed with that person for a week or so, but they were getting kicked out, so my friend, who's much cooler and more organized than I am, put together a train ride for me from Illinois to Pennsylvania. It's been 1 year. I have no idea what I'm doing with my life, and I'm still not a normal, functional human. After a long time of not knowing what was up, I messaged my little sister, 14-ish, and she was really happy to talk to me. Apparently, my family is thriving with me gone? I'm not sure why exactly, but my mom, after 20 years of not having a job, finally has one, and apparently they have hot water and gas and utilities all the time now? I've lived through bouts of no electricity or water or heat with that woman, and now I'm gone, they're fine. And my sisters are allowed to go hang out with people now, and they can have friends over there? When I was living there, tried as I might, I couldn't fend off the bugs and garbage and mold. I'm glad my sisters are good now, but I wonder why I wasn't able to have that steady, normal life. Makes me feel like I was the cursed one, and now that I'm gone, the curse has traveled with me, and everyone there is going to be okay. Meanwhile, I'm now safe, but still a mess. Story 27. My story is a little different and I apologize, but I grew up in the aftermath of something like this. Before my parents got together, my dad was married and they had a daughter. His wife had an affair with his therapist, who then told her all my dad's traumas and triggers so she could use them against him. When she had him at just the right point of breakdown, she took my sister and disappeared. Just poof, gone, no trace. My dad looked for her, hired investigators, tried everything. 8 years later, my mom and dad married, and I was born a year after that. I remember from childhood that there were 2 pictures of a little girl who looked like me, and I was told it was my sister, but it didn't mean anything to me because I didn't understand. My parents chose to stay in the same town and at the same address no matter what, so that if my sister ever came looking, he'd be easily found. He kept a gift-wrapped Kermit the Frog on the top shelf of his closet that had been a present for her 3rd birthday that he never got to give her. One morning when I was 8, he got a phone call. He said hello, paused, identified himself by his full name, then went pale. I remember him saying, "This is a joke. It isn't funny." It wasn't a joke, though. It was my sister. She was about to graduate high school and had recently learned that her horrible stepfather, the goddamn therapist, was not her biological father, and so had wanted to meet her real family. We've been very close ever since. She knows now that Dad never stopped looking for her, and everything she told was a lie. Dad was finally able to give her the Kermit stuffed animal, and she has it displayed in her house. It's had a huge impact on all of us. For a long time, my dad was terrified that my sister was going to disappear again, or hate him, and to an extent still worries about it. My sister had been psychologically and SA'd by the therapist's stepfather and had a hard time trusting for a while. I did pretty well until my ex-husband and I split up. He knew the story, so one of his tactics was to take our son on 2 separate occasions and disappear with him. The first time he was only gone for 2 weeks. The second time was a month. That was hell, but it's over. Story 28. I didn't actually do it, but my ex-boyfriend did. We had been dating for 3 years by the time I got pregnant. We broke up early into my pregnancy, but we remained civil with each other. We were young. I lived with my parents, and he lived with his dad and 3 brothers. Never seen his mother. He told me she left him and his brothers behind when he was about 5 and moved to another state. One day, he came and told me he had been talking to his mom. He was happy about it, and I was happy for him. Time went on, and eventually he told me that his mother paid for a round-trip ticket for him and his brothers to go and visit her. Long story short, he left and never came back. Our son is 3 years old, and he's never met him, never spoken to him, and never told his family about him either. He used to ask me about him here and there, but that eventually stopped too. His entire plan was to leave me pregnant and alone without telling his family about this. He sort of brushed my child under the rug. He's had another baby since and is completely involved in her life. Story 29. I don't know if this counts, but when I was 17, I was on probation and I had a curfew for it. Well, I had met this girl and we hooked up. I fell asleep and I woke up and I had a text from my mom saying that because I didn't come home that night, she called my probation officer and told her that I missed my curfew, so my PO put out a detention order for me and that the police were looking for me and to come home. Well, I wasn't going for that crap, so I told the girl I hooked up with what was up, and we told her parents what was up. They let me stay with them, and her dad gave me a job at his company, so I could save up enough to go where I was going to go. So about a month into this, me and her dad were talking, and he told me he liked how I worked, and that if I wanted, I could turn myself in, and he would help me fight my case and go to bat for me, and in return, I could work for him. And I could continue staying with them because my home life wasn't that great. So naturally I thought that was a better deal than being on the run and being caught later down the line. It's better to go in on your own terms, so that's what I did. We talked to my PO and she agreed not to send me to detention while I'm fighting my case, and I just stayed with them. Look, I don't mean to be mean here, this is just stupid. Not a good idea. Eventually it's going to catch up with you. Turn yourself in, man. Don't run from your PO. Story 30. When I was 10, my dad was having a serious affair with a lady from another city. When I say serious, I mean he was really in love with her. My mom had gotten over his other adventures and tried keeping her family together, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back, or how we say in Mexico, the drop that overflowed the glass. My dad would take this lady to our home and make my mom cater to her and her family. She was married too. Of course, at this time, my mom didn't know about what was going on, but one day the lady called my mom and told her he was with him, and she says you could hear my dad in the background telling her to hang up the phone. The day before we left, it was my uncle's wedding from my dad's side. I don't know what happened, but next day my dad was still super drunk from the party, and my mom picked us up from school and got us in a 3-day trip to her family in Los Angeles. We got to see my dad again after a few months. He tried to make my mom come back with us, but he was still seeing this other person. I love both of them equally, but my dad was an a-hole, to be honest. The lady was one of the most beautiful women I've ever known. She's now in a wheelchair with a problem in her back. My poor dad is no longer with her or anyone living alone in the home that was once ours, always asking about my mom and telling us to come back. I'm living with my mom in LA at the moment. Story 31. I was a freshman in high school, about 14 to 15 years old. I was living with my dad and, now ex-stepmom, in less than ideal conditions, mostly emotional abuse and neglect. After talking to my friends and a trusted teacher about what I should do, I decided to see if I could move back in with my mom. I didn't tell my dad, or ex-stepmom. I just stayed home from school that day and called my mom to come get me. I didn't have too much time to prep because my dad would have caught on, so I had 30 minutes to throw the things I wanted to keep in a garbage bag, grab my cat, and leave. The worst part of the storm came when I decided that going back for a weekend visit was the right thing to do. My father sat me down, screamed in my face for 3 hours, and told me how I would never really be his daughter again. He wouldn't even let me get tissues to blow my nose. I had to sit there with thick ropes of snot running down my face while he etched the words, "You're my daughter, but," into my heart. His whole thing was he was disappointed that I didn't tell him I was moving. The man partially responsible for the abuse and neglect. The kicker to the whole thing is that he left our family, my mom, myself, my little sister, without telling anyone when I was 7. I really wanted to throw that in his face. I learned it from you! I don't think he'd find it as funny as I do. Story 32. My children's father essentially did this to us. His grandma died and he went halfway across the country to go to her funeral. He was only supposed to be gone for 5 days, but he just never came back. We had 4 small kids who adored him. Before he left, there was no indication that there was anything wrong. It was just our happy, normal life. At first, I worried he had been hurt or killed in an accident because he just stopped responding to me on day 4 of the trip. Finally, the day after he was supposed to return, his mother called me and said I needed to stop calling and he had moved on and wasn't coming back. At first, it was devastating. He and I both worked full-time to support our family, so him disappearing just about wiped me out financially. The kids and I lost our home and moved into a way too small apartment. The kids had a really hard time understanding what had happened and had a lot of behavior issues for a long time after that. He was gone for about 2.5 years with minimal contact. Then one day he showed up again and acted like nothing ever happened. I noped him the F away from us and avoid him at all costs now. I never got a full explanation for why he did what he did, but I heard from an old mutual friend that he hooked up with an old girlfriend from high school. Story 33. Usually a lurker, decided to make an account for this post in the hopes that if there's anyone out there like me, they'll find some strength. I was raised by my grandparents. Raise is a loose term here. My mother had a criminal record a mile long. She had been a violent criminal for most of her life. When I was very young, she killed her girlfriend in front of me. Originally, she had intended to kill me. Instead, she ended up slitting her girlfriend's throat. I know this because of the newspaper clippings. I'll never forget having them hung over my head. You're going to be just like her anyways. You'll never amount to anything. You're just going to hurt people. I'll never forget going through the obligatory goth phase of a depressed teenager and being disowned over it. Well, now that I'm older, I know disowned by these people is kind of redundant, but I digress. I was around 13 at that time. 27 now. I was allowed snail mail communication with my mother in jail. I sent her photographs of myself and my first girlfriend. I had only just realized I might be interested in women after meeting her and wanted to tell someone. I was so happy to find someone close to me who I considered a good friend and partner. My grandmother physically fought me over the letters. I remember her reading them and staying ominously quiet. I was not allowed privacy, friends, or contact outside of school. Making contacts inside of school was equally heretical. I frequently saw the school counselor, who desperately wanted me to have a therapist, but I was not allowed to see one. My grandmother told me if I ever contacted anyone of authority, she would tell them she didn't know what I was talking about. When I turned 14, my mom got out of jail. It was also at this age that I started experiencing psychosis. My grandmother didn't believe in psychology, and my grandfather was an enabler. He didn't want to argue with her and would rather let her control everything, so there was no hope of psychological intervention. Finally, I called my mother. I had never talked to her before, but I went outside with the home phone and called her. She started crying. She really wanted to meet me. She came and picked me up, called her current girlfriend and said, "You'll never believe who I have in the car." For the first time in my life, I felt like someone actually wanted to know me. She took me to a drug hideout within the first 2 days. She shot up heroin with her girlfriend while I talked to a very charismatic man outside. I asked him how he knew her. He didn't answer, just smiled at me. I was dazzled, as young teens are prone to being. My mom came out and told me, "Don't talk to him. He's a lady killer. Bad man." I didn't know what to do after the weekend was over. I had to go back to school. I told her I'd see her again sometime. I told my grandmother what happened, and she called my mother and went ballistic. That following Thanksgiving, she was murdered. Her and the man she was staying with. The charismatic man I had talked to was in the mugshot. Apparently, he was the girlfriend's nephew and was sick of being their slave. My grandmother had to go and identify the corpse. That was the worst day in Dixie Alley. I lived in Georgia for tornadoes. The amount of storms that leveled entire cities was insane. All I remember is being on a forum like always, role-playing with my friends. I never talked about my personal life. The power went out, and I distinctly remember this feeling of overwhelming peace. I'm going to die in this storm. I'm finally going to feel something. I can't describe that feeling of true tranquility. I was so elated. I felt weightless. I woke up to my grandmother having a screaming match with my grandfather. I had passed out in the closet where I'd gone to hide for the storms. They were still going well into the night, but the panic attacks let me hyperventilate enough to calm me down. I remember that day a lot, when there are windy storms. Thankfully, I live on the West Coast now. There are far less tornadoes here. My grandmother flipped a switch the following year. She refused to talk about my mother at all. I had been raised thinking this person was Satan, going to hell, deserving of the worst, deserves to be hated just like you. Then, radio silence. There was no answer for me, no real closure. My grandmother told me she was dead and there was nothing more to say. Suddenly, my mother's shadow was no longer looming over me. Comparison wasn't allowed. My whole identity based up to that point had been that comparison. I was entirely lost. I had no idea what to do, who to talk to. I was allowed a therapist for 3 days. I told her my grandmother was abusive. She said, "Families are harsh sometimes, but we live with it." My grandmother took me out of it because she knew the only thing I had to talk about was her. I left home at 15. I grabbed my things and moved in with a local friend. I still went to the same school. I hopped around until I graduated, early, with the least amount of credits I needed. I met a now ex in Miami and ended up moving there. I've taken Greyhounds that last a week or more. I've lived out of motels and slept on the street. I've crashed on couches and traversed the states simply for the promise of a paying job. I would never once go back there. I now live in Seattle with a wonderful partner and 2 gorgeous cats on a lake reserve. My options are limited due to my upbringing and the situation I was in. My credit is already crashed and my mental health is rampantly out of command. I'm on multiple prescription medications, but nothing seems to be working. That said, I'm not helpless. I think there's good in this world. If I ever have the privilege of being able to go to school, I want to be a criminologist. I want to write papers on the ratio of abuse to incarceration. I don't think my mom was any different from me. I think I was just so scared of hurting people that I went in exactly the opposite direction. If even one person feels lost or like their life is meaningless, if even one person reads this, I want them to know something. Maybe you are alone. Who knows? But you have you. You can be the best that you can be. And if you're living out of spite, then F it. That's still a reason to live. People tout all the time. You're not alone. People care. But sometimes that's just not the case. Sometimes you really don't have that luxury. But if you believe, even for a second, in yourself, that you can be more than anyone ever expected of you, that you can keep pushing and make the whole world eat their words, then that's what you should do. Be ferociously independent and compete with yourself. You'll be amazed at who wins. Sincerely, Micah, self-employed artist. So I really don't have a whole lot to say. Pretty self-explanatory, pretty powerful, but I just wanted to spotlight that. If anyone needs to go back and read that again, listen to that again, just want that message to get through. But anyway, let's move on. Story 34. My grandmother used to tell me the story of how my step-grandfather had a daughter from his first marriage. The mother was apparently quite emotionally unstable, and the court awarded my grandfather custody. Very rare in the 1940s, apparently, as it is still today. But as he was getting on the plane with the baby, the mother said, "If you take her, I'll unalive myself." So he gave her the baby, got on the plane alone, and never saw either of them again. I was very young when she told this story, and now as an adult, I realize how, what the F, this story is. Now that there's no one to ask a follow-up question. Oh, my grandfather's name was Vern, and he named his baby daughter Vernelda. He then left her with an emotionally messed up mom. Enjoy that life path. Update. Not that anyone is really following along, but this post got me thinking about this again after a long time. I spoke to my sister to see if she remembers the story. She remembered parts of it, but basically backed up my version of the story, related by my grandmother, so already third hand. However, I was wrong on the name. It was Verna D., not Vernelda. I think the mother's name was Griselda, and I may have confused them. So I looked around and found her, sort of. I found a listing for a Verna D., fairly distinct last name, in the city I know my grandfather was stationed in during basic training, World War II. She graduated from high school in 1963. From there, the trail goes cold. But I did find a few mentions of her name in the unnamed city monitor from where she was young, which was cool. If I find anything else out, I'll update, just in case anyone wants to know. Story 35. My partner is Vietnamese. She was being heavily abused by her mom, so we decided she should move in with me to live a better life. One night, her mom called her as we just got back to their apartment after a night out, and she said, you've been hanging out with Bailey again, haven't you? When I get home, I'm going to make sure you never see him again. Now, normally that wouldn't be that evil. However, I had been the reason she started learning how to live, going outside and wanting more for herself than to just live with her mum and do all the chores whilst getting called donkey brains on occasion. We quickly packed her things and put a shoe in the elevator so that her mum couldn't get up. Her mum rang and said something's wrong with the elevator, so we pulled one shoe out and waited for it to be halfway up before going down the other elevator. We ran to the train station and went on a 2-hour trip back to my place. She's been laughing and happy ever since. That was nearly 3 years ago. She's since learned to not abuse animals and that she has her own self-worth and is worth listening to. She now knows that if she remembers something, she should trust herself more and not instantly assume the other person is right. She's a hardcore cat lover who looks up techniques on how to pet cats well. Quite an upgrade when she used to bite and throw them. She's pretty dependent on me at the moment. We have a fair way to go before she'll be independent. She was raised with just her dad, extremely rich old guy in Vietnam, with maids in apartment buildings owned by him. Her mother left her when she was 6, and she moved back in with her mother here in Australia when she was 15. Her dad's apparently buying us a house, so hopefully that goes well. We tried to give her mother a chance to stick around, but she just kept bullying her every time we tried. She's cut off now. Long read, but a lot went down, lol. I even left out the chapter where her dad kept her in Vietnam against her will, and I had to go get her. Story 36. Not exactly the scenario OP requested, but not too far off. My mother took my sister, 11 at the time, and a 1-year-old me on a cross-country road trip. As we traveled from coast to coast, her and her boyfriend, keep in mind she was married to my dad at the time, they would go stop to eat while we waited in the car eating dry cereal and whatever scraps we were lucky enough to get. This went on for thousands of miles, and throughout her little journey, she came to the realization that maybe, just maybe, she's not cut out for this whole motherhood thing. She also had 2 other daughters she completely abandoned with another ex of hers. After realizing she made a mistake trying to be something she wasn't, a mother, she dropped us off with child welfare services in California with a note saying who we were and to call my father. My dad, of course, got us back home, and all was as well as it could be. That happened in 1983. I met my mother for the first time last year, and we now have a pretty good relationship. Many of my friends and family called me crazy for even wanting to meet her, and I had my doubts. But I understand people change, and ultimately, she's someone I spent my entire life wondering who she was, what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, and what it would feel like to hug her. Glad to say I've crossed those off my list. Story 37. Not for a pack of cigarettes, but I lived with an extremely controlling family member. I wasn't allowed to get a job or do anything outside of college classes and stay home and game and take care of our pets. Naturally, I started long-distance dating. For years, she rationalized excuses for not trusting people. Are you sure you like this guy? Can you really trust him? Etc., etc. Eventually, I made plans to see my ex, whereupon she blew up. Stated she was going to keep me in the house and tell my other friends who were going with me that I was sick and not going unless I broke it off with him and canceled the plans to see him. He'd already bought a hotel room and bus tickets to meet me. He and I broke up over it. This was after years of discussions with her about meeting in public places with friends if I ever met up with anyone I met online. We were going to meet in Times Square, with 3 of my high school friends with me for a single day. At the time, I didn't question her, but it broke something in me, especially when I learned he'd look for me too when he was there. Despite it all, and we still missed each other. I promised myself I'd never make the same mistake again. So time rolls on and I meet someone else. After a year, we're serious about meeting up. He starts making plans to come see me, but she keeps making reasons to put it off. We don't have time with her work. The dog is really sick, literally dying, so I need to stay and concentrate on her for a while. College is more important, etc. My boyfriend and I spend 6+ months trying to plan something, and the money was running out to do anything because of excuses she made to delay. She'd put it off long enough that literally the only thing we could afford was one of us driving to the other and staying at that person's place for a while. She dragged me to various therapists who all told me that at 23, I could make my own decisions, but she insisted I do it safer, and she'd pay for it. It never materialized. My boyfriend and I decided we'd do it anyway. We were both adults, and this was getting ridiculous. We couldn't afford to wait on her time to do it, or it would never happen. The day before he was due to drive up, she realized what was going to happen and threw a fit. She threatened to get rid of my animals, a threat she'd used before, but that time I didn't back down. She stormed out of the house for several hours. She came back home with a new pistol that she practiced with outside of my bedroom window, shooting some kind of pellet practice round. She had some kind of breakdown, threatening to shoot anyone who came to the property that she felt threatened by, and how I would, and this is a direct quote, be SA'd consensually or not, and never come home. The police were called by two separate people, but she hid the gun so nothing happened. Needless to say, I called off anyone showing up for fear of their safety. To make a long story somewhat shortened, I tried to get her a therapist that ended up mine. That therapist did so much for me, explaining much of my mother's behavior that I hadn't understood before, and gave me a lot to read and think about. She explained how my mother wasn't going to get any better since, to this day, she still doesn't get what she did wrong. My therapist told me that for my own safety, I needed to leave. The only place I had was to go out of state with a long-distance boyfriend I'd never met in person. She asked me why I hadn't done it yet, so we made plans, and while my mother was at work, he showed up, we packed his car, and disappeared. It was hell. I couldn't prep at all to leave to risk tipping her off, but it was worth it. I get to be my own person now, and somehow she and I are still on speaking terms. I wouldn't normally recommend running away with your internet boyfriend, but it's the best decision I ever made. We're still happily together 5 years later, and my mother was right. I didn't ever go back. Story 38. This was planned for a while. I got a visa, packed everything into a suitcase, and brought a non-return flight halfway across the world. I had been back and forth between countries due to school, so I didn't raise suspicions with the suitcase, and my friend was helping me because they knew how emotionally abusive my parents were. I remember sitting there watching TV with my dad after setting up on the Christmas tree together and feeling the guilt and panic overwhelming me. But I heard the doorbell ring and knew it was time. I pretended I needed to go out to see who was at the door. I took my suitcase, walked into my friend's car, and he drove off as I cried and screamed into my jacket. Anyways, the aftermath. They started calling everyone, including him, and he pretended he was out at work. They contacted me a few different ways, asking me to come home immediately. Some friends of mine went to the airport to see me off. At that point, there was no turning back. I returned an email explaining that I was safe and that I had told them many times I was leaving. And I'm sorry if they never believed me or helped me, but I was choosing my own path. Since I've moved over, my parents and I talk occasionally on Skype and have a better connection with each other. They can't manipulate me or lock me in my room or sever my contact with the outside world anymore. They do sometimes call the police on me or contact my workplace, but it's easily handled. My grandmother, who even helped me leave, misses me dearly, but is proud and understanding. My friends were there for me, and we talk on Messenger or Discord occasionally. I'm much happier now, and I'm happy I did it. I struggled with the guilt of how I went at first, suddenly and with a lie, but there wasn't any other viable option for me at the time, and I tried to leave amicably many times only to be punished. I should also mention I had a job and was in my 20s, so it's not like I ran away as a child. I was an adult, and I'm now living in a way that I want, not my parents. Story 39. So I grew up in a pretty neglectful family. We lost our house when I was 7 because of some complicated family stuff that I'll spare all of you. It sent my parents spiraling deeper into a drug addiction that they had been managing quite well up to that point. We lost pretty much everything, and from that point forward, we were moving around pretty much constantly, never really able to stay in one place for too long. We crashed with my other family members, occasionally managed to work out deals with landlords to be able to stay in trailers for a while, but never anything stable. I never knew when coming home from school whether or not I'd actually have a place to stay that night, or if we'd be packing the car and trying to stay over at a cousin's place or something. I didn't mind too much. I loved my family, even if we were really poor and lacked stability. But over the years, their addiction got worse and worse, to the point where they were pawning our things and using the money I would scrape together for field trips and such in order to buy drugs. Then it started cutting into the food we bought, until sometimes we weren't eating anything at all except for at school. The breaking point for me was when one of the people they did drugs with tried to get me to give him a BJ. I was 11. I got scared and told my parents, and they said they wouldn't let him come over again. But the next time he showed up with drugs, and they let him in. I remember hiding in the bathroom and crying. It was a couple of years later before I got out of there. My older brother's friend took an interest in me when I was 13. I fancied myself in love with him because he was so nice to me and treated me okay, and would bring me food and generally care for me in a way I hadn't been cared for in a long time. Long story short, he convinced me to legally have myself removed from my home on grounds of neglect. So I did, and I was allowed to move in with his family as a foster home. His father was an abusive drunk. I wish I could say that was the worst part of it, but it wasn't. So my new stepbrother, the one I thought cared about me, turned out to be a hardcore sexual predator. I endured 4 years of abuse from him. It was pretty horrific. I was essayed, I was physically harmed, pictures were taken of me in compromising positions, I was emotionally manipulated, and I still have scars from the things he did to me. When I graduated high school, I immediately enrolled in college, took out loans to pay for it, and slipped out quietly on the day I was supposed to leave. I came back for Christmas, I think, and one other holiday, and then I stopped answering my phone. Stopped responding, and stopped going back to them. My biological parents cleaned up. We reconciled, and we're back in touch now. The person who helped me slip away to college and was my roommate is now my partner of over 10 years. I love him dearly. I flunked out of that first stint at college, but I went back in 2016, and I'm finally actually graduating this year. Most importantly, I never went back there, and I never got back in contact with them. I spent years having nightmares and being terrified that he would find me, but now I have a cheap, crappy, cozy apartment with someone I care about deeply, and we have 2 cats, and I'm about to have a degree. Things are okay. I'm okay. Story 40. My uncle, Uncle A, went to work as a truck driver one day and never came home to his wife and 3 kids. I'm not 100% positive, but I believe at the time she was a stay-at-home mom, so they were left in a really bad spot with essentially no income. My other uncle, Uncle B, who happens to be Uncle A's brother, apparently helped the wife and kids stay afloat. He helped so much, in fact, that Uncle B married Uncle A's now ex-wife. A couple years later, my dad, Uncle A and Uncle B were his brothers, found Uncle A under an overpass over 1,000 miles away from home. Apparently, heroin is what caused him to disappear and become homeless for several years. Uncle A, with his mother's help, ended up going back to his hometown and after several relapses over the course of 4 to 5 years, stayed sober for 6-ish years until he passed away from complications from drug and alcohol abuse. The kids never really forgave their dad, Uncle A, understandably so, and consider Uncle B their dad, their uncle by blood. Their mom left Uncle B shortly after Uncle A died. Surprisingly, Uncle B is an alcoholic, and the mom just didn't want that in her life any longer. Story 41. A little over a year ago, my father found out I was bisexual after reading documents that were intended for my suspension appeal. He didn't take it lightly and basically disowned me first, then apologized, then told me he'd rather have a murderer over a gay son, and gave me a year to leave. My mother claims he gave me a year to work things out. I left in August in 2 trips. My mother knew, but my father did not know. At some point, I told him I was leaving anyway. He was pretty pissed, but I told him I was done with this crap. Months later, he wanted me back home, but in the same conversation, would tell me how I was going to get AIDS, or did I have a few chats with my parents. But a lot happened. It's 9 months since I left home. I ended up staying in a dorm at my university and was lucky to pick up a decent paying job to help cover any unexpected expenses. Life just went so uphill, but I still need lots of therapy to just work on my issues. I miss my brothers and my grandmother, but I do not miss my parents because they don't really love me. I told them straight up, love isn't telling me that you want me home, but then ridicule me for not dating a woman and not wanting to give you grandkids, or telling me that I'll get AIDS because I'm dating a guy. My mother also got really disappointed at me because I asked my best friend's mother to take care of me for a few days during my surgery, a surgery that I initially went alone to. Story 42. A few months before this, a guy in Army Greens came to my high school of 1,500 and gave a presentation to about 7 kids, of which I was the only girl. Apparently, he had asked the counselors for a list of at-risk youth, and we were who they deemed worthy. Anyway, the dude was there to talk about a military-style academy that he worked for. The Challenge program, if you're familiar, where 16 to 18-year-olds lives on a military base with 50 other kids from around the state in their platoon and are taught drill and ceremony and all the military stuff, and are basically enrolled in basic training for 6 months. No internet, phones, anything. I went on a tour of the base with the only other kid who was interested, but he ended up not going because of his family. I told my mom about the school offhandedly and told her I wasn't really considering going, but she encouraged me to consider it. This being the same mother who gets drunk every night with her sister, who lives with us, and tells me how much of a disappointment I am as a daughter. The second I decided I wanted to go, she was immediately against it again. I only said you should think about it because I knew you wouldn't make it through that program anyway, and I never even told you that you should go, were some of her favorite lines whenever I brought this up. She refused to help me with anything related to applying for the program, spent a lot of time telling me I would fail, and just generally construing reality. The morning that the program started, I brought the 10 pair of gray shorts and black t-shirts that they told us to bring and called my debate teacher to pick me up. I told my mom I'm going to school on my way out the door, but I felt like she knew what I meant. Eventually, the 6 months ended and I was back in the same spot. My mom came to my graduation with the whole family and told me how proud she was and how she always knew I would make it through. I just graduated high school last month and I'm still trying to get out of here. Story 43. I have a similar story, but nothing wild. Growing up, my dad was prior military and old farm boy. The word strict doesn't come close to how our house was run. When my dad was angry, anything in reach was thrown. Glasses, shoes, remotes, you get the idea. As I got older, I started throwing things back. I looked after my little brother, and I tried to fight back. At this point in my life, my dad is around 5'10", 240 pounds. I'm the same height, maybe 140. My dad had a secret addiction to adult film material, and my mom had a bottle of wine a night drinking problem of her own. That collided one night after a rather bad fist fight between my dad and my mom. I was 14, and my mom took us and we left that night. Everything was okay for a little while. My mom stopped drinking for a few months, and my dad was so ashamed he didn't even call. Slowly but surely, the drinking started back up, and my mom began to verbally abuse my younger brother. He's 10 and I'm 15 at this point, blaming him for the divorce and his lack of progress in school, etc. One night, I tell my mom to stop, and it needs to end. She slaps me. My mom always had her nails done. She's a beautiful woman, really, and always well kept. She cuts my face open in a few spots. I push her. My uncle, her brother, comes in and sees me push her. Things get heated and physical. The neighbors call the cops, and my mom is so drunk they arrest her, and I'm taken away to juvenile detention. Long story short, my dad comes to get me, as he's a legal guardian who has no reason not to come and get me. We don't speak the whole car ride home, and I can't remember a word said for the first 3 weeks I lived with him. My brother chose to stay at my mom's, and joint custody is established. I don't see my mom for years. I know what was going on through my brother, but she never calls, texts, nothing. She makes it known that I'm dead to her. My father and I catch up on the year I've been gone, and we become very close. He chooses to find religion and peace in his life. We go to counseling and create a new relationship. Fast forward 10 years. I get a phone call from my mom's husband. She has pancreatic cancer and goes in for surgery the next day. If you know anything about pancreatic cancer, you know it's very slim survival rates. I fly to see my mom overnight. I've since left my hometown, joined the military, completed my tour, and made a life for myself in Las Vegas, of all places. I walk in, and my mom rolls over in the bed to face away from me. My mom is one of the most stubborn people you will meet. I sat down, as I had told my boss I'd be gone for a week. I probably sat there for 3 or 4 hours before she says hello to me. I realize she's been crying the whole time. She explains she has felt awful this whole time and never knew how to apologize to me. It's a two-way street, and I agree I haven't been the best son to reach out. For the next week, we reconnect and catch up. My mom's surgery was successful, and I talk to her on the phone every weekend. So just want to shout out the happy ending here. Not only does mother survive the pancreatic cancer, but now they're back on speaking terms again. So good for you guys. You give us all hope. Story 44. I had it with my stepmother. I spent the previous 11 years with my self-medicated, paranoid, schizophrenic mother, and I moved in with my dad and his wife. His wife is nutty too and would degrade me, pick on me, belittle me. She just isn't a nice person. But after being with my mother for that long, I had it with crazy people. So I just left. I moved in with a buddy. We went back a few weeks later for my things, which my stepmom packed and put outside in the barn, and she threw out a lot of irreplaceable things. I stayed with him for a bit, then stayed with another friend. I eventually moved in with my mom's ex-boyfriend, who was like a father to me. I stayed with him for a few years. Things turned ugly. He started coming on to me. By that time, I had mostly gotten over my anger towards my mom. I moved back in with her. I got my license, got a car, worked 2 jobs, got my certification to become a CNA, and moved in with my now husband, where every day I feel safe and loved. We have a cool, spacious, secluded, and affordable apartment, saving up our money to buy a house. We both have good-paying jobs and are comfortable. We have newer, reliable cars. It was a long and hard journey, but I made it. Story 45. I moved in with the girl I'd only met 4 days prior, from Florida to Minnesota, because I couldn't stand being under my mom's thumb anymore. She employed me, but paid me only just enough for food and gas and nothing more. fully expecting me to ask her for additional money. At 28 years old, this just did not appeal to me anymore. So I had talked to this girl I met online in a not safe for work Discord server. We vibed. We played MHW together and League of Legends. She made me feel special, wanted. 4 days after meeting her, I got into a nasty fight with my cousin who was living with me at the time because he was upset that I was choosing to spend time with the new girl instead of going and doing what he wanted to do. I admit, I flew off the handle after he got in my face, and to keep from hitting him, I decided to tear down the door to my room with my fists. Then went to my truck and drove off to a spot I like to chill at and vented to this girl. She said that she could buy my return ticket if things didn't work out, so I bought a one-way to Minnesota, 8 hours out from that point. After calming down mildly, I went back to the house, packed my suitcase, packed my gaming systems, didn't say a word to my cousin, mom was out of town, dad lives retired in Central Florida. Called an Uber to the Fort Lauderdale airport 7 hours before my flight because I didn't want to deal with the fallout of this decision. I never mentioned to my parents that this girl was an MTF trans woman. They would never understand, nor treat her like a human being. I know I'm being raised by them. So I'm at the airport with 6.5 hours to kill. So I download Langrisser and plug into an outlet and hang out at the gate for that time, mulling over the decision and talking to another group of friends who were very supportive. About 6 hours in connecting flight from Atlanta, and I landed in Minneapolis. She came to pick me up in her hatchback, and we held hands the whole way back to her place. It's been 3 weeks since that happened. I'm finally handling my student loans I defaulted on because the new apartment we wanted to rent wouldn't look at my application otherwise, and I couldn't let her lose out on the place because of my past mistakes. I have a job lined up on the 20th at Amazon. Seasonal, but I'm hopeful that I'll move up the ladder fairly easily. Not hopeful, confident, because that's what she instills in me. Confidence in my own decisions. She lifts me up when I'm at my lows. We watch anime and play video together. My cousin and I still talk. He fell into a depression and quit his job that was exploiting him, and snapped out of the funk within a week, thankfully. This girl makes me feel happy. She listens to me. She takes my advice. She gives me her own. We hold hands, we kiss, we hug. We say I love you, and it never feels old. I'm helping her deal with her life as she helps me deal with mine. She completes me. I love her. My dad said he was proud of me for making a decision and sticking to it. Said that it was the most mature thing I've done. That felt nice. Mom, for the most part, still sends me quotes about God and how I will always be a part of me no matter what, and in the same breath sends me anti-trans memes. I don't think I can ever bring my girlfriend to visit there. No one in my family would accept her. We've both come to terms with that, and she gets it. Not a single complaint. I love her. I want to spend the rest of my life with her. The new job and hopefully the new apartment are sealing my life here in Minnesota, and I've never been happier. Story 46. My sister convinced me to not invite my mom to my apartment for Christmas dinner. I feel guilty about it, but also my mother is a malignant narcissist who would always think of something you did wrong and put you down for it even if it happened years ago. My sister couldn't afford to move out of the house, so she puts up with our mother every day and told me she would ruin Christmas. She already ruined Thanksgiving with her toxicity. And moreover, I haven't fully gotten over the abuse either. Anyway, we had Christmas dinner without her, and it was the first time it felt like we ever had a normal family gathering. Even my dad was having a good time and relaxing. I knew my mom would be furious if she found out about it, and even though I'm a full-grown woman, part of me is afraid to face her and explain to her why I didn't invite her. Thing is, she gets angry about one little thing or complains about one little thing, and then you just cannot stop her from yelling her head off. Then she acts like it's not a big deal when in fact she's extremely difficult to handle and we're just tired of her crap. Story 47. This is probably going to get buried, but I might as well share. In the summer of 2017, at the age of 18, I came out as trans, and it was nothing short of disastrous. My parents cut all financial support. They didn't even let me eat their food, while I was severely underweight from undiagnosed celiac disease. They didn't support me going on hormones, getting top surgery, etc., and told me I looked like a lesbian. They then claimed to be supportive, but yelled at me when I questioned that. They said and did worse, but I scrubbed a lot from my memory. You can check my post history for details. They repeatedly threatened to kick me out of the house. They tracked down my therapist even as I paid for my own sessions and hid her info. My mom calling my therapist in the middle of our session, saying she knew I was there, is something that still haunts me. On June 4th, 2017, my parents told me I was no longer allowed to leave the house, and if I did, they would call 911 and say I was wanting to self-unalive. At that point, I had already been safety planning and made a go bag days before. I grabbed it and made a dash for the door. My parents pushed me down. I tried to call for help and realized that I was a trans kid in rural America. The police were not my friend. When I tried to get to my car, my dad opened the trunk and disconnected the battery. My parents then proudly proclaimed that if I wanted to leave, I had to walk. At that point, this sounded like a great idea. As I tried to walk away, they pushed me and held me down in the trunk of my car. I called my friend for help, and he picked me up. My friends then went crying to everyone that their poor, confused daughter had an eating disorder and was hallucinating being trans. And people effing bought it. They effing bought it. I got returned home. The rest of that summer, my therapist pulled together a team of 6 professionals to get me out of my house. I kept ending up in and out, especially as my parents tried to force me to sign my power of attorney to them. In the meantime, I went on hormones in secret with the help of a letter from my therapist. These various professionals pretended to be on my parents' side and manipulated them into agreeing to pay for the next semester of college. After a particularly intense family therapy session, where my parents refused to even pay for a piece of luggage, much less even drive me to college, they claimed to not have the time, I stayed behind to cry to the psychologist. I'll never forget what he said to me. If it means only carrying your backpack to get out, do it. Get out of there, and you never have to look back. And that's exactly what I did. I shipped some things out. I grabbed my backpack, and under the guise of leaving for college, I left for good. Whether or not I haven't looked back, I don't know. My severe PTSD makes me look back more than I'd like. My intense grief for my little sister has quite literally landed me in the hospital, and my parents have continued to send harassing emails from random accounts and call from strange numbers. A few months ago, I found out under my state law, parents are required to support their children until 21, and I'm just a few months shy of 21. So I've taken my parents to court with the help of a pro bono legal team. It's messy. My parents are alleging that not only am I lying, but I'm abusing them by cutting contact. They even wanted me to do a public apology for speaking badly about them. Going to court isn't about looking back at my trauma. It's about taking care of myself. It's acknowledging that homelessness isn't healthy for me. It's acknowledging that I'm a survivor. Going to court is me pushing back against years of abuse and saying that I deserve to be taken care of. I deserve basic support. I deserve to be free from harassment. I deserve to be allowed to see my sister. My parents chose to bring me into this world, so they need to keep up with their commitment. I'm not a burden. They're not holding their end of the deal. Am I looking back? Maybe, but if I'm looking back, it's looking back so I can move forward. Story 48. Since I can remember, my parents hated each other and us. There were always fights when my dad was home. He worked in gas and oil, meaning he could be away from home for up to 6 months. And after my 2 older brothers finally left for good, it was up to me to protect my 2 younger siblings from them. It was always tough, but things got so much worse when my mother began drinking heavily and started hitting us more and more. Primarily me, since I wanted to protect my siblings. Fast forward a few years. She burned my brother's friend's hand on the stove after dinner was made, and we were taken into state custody after they saw the state of the house and learned of the extreme abuse from both parents. Luckily, we were put into kinship care pretty quickly with our grandparents, but my grandmother was just as verbally abusive as my mother. I was the target and quickly became wanting to self-unalive and turn to self-harm, as I had no friends due to isolating myself in an effort to take better care of my siblings. After a year, my mother managed to get custody back. My father died, and I was still hurting myself. After she tried to kill me the first time when I was 15, I left to stay with a friend. Eventually, I came back and followed the same path that my older brothers, leaving and returning multiple times. Finally, my senior year of high school, I moved in with my boyfriend's dad, who was a saint and the first person I was able to simulate a healthy parental relationship with. I had gotten into a fight with my mom, called the police, and after they blamed me for everything, I had had enough. I told my mom I was going to a friend's the next night and never came back. I grabbed my dog, packed some clothes, and took off. I knew it was the last time I was leaving. I had been working for a while as my mother didn't, and I needed to make sure my siblings could be fed. So I saved up enough to move on with my boyfriend of 3 years right before college. Eventually, I broke up with him as he was verbally and later physically abusive to me. As of now, I'm almost 5 years clean of self-harm and I'm working towards a degree, something I wouldn't be able to do if I was still living with my mom. My relationship with my younger siblings was strained for a while. They resented me for leaving like I resented my older brothers. My sister is following a similar path to what I led, but after being moved out for over a year, our relationships have gotten much better. My mom is luckily not as awful and hasn't tried to kill any of her other children, but she's still the devil in my eyes. Leaving left me with a lot of self-hatred, but it was for the best. As many others have said in response to this, you have to put your oxygen mask on first. Things have gotten much better since I left, but it's been hard. You deal with a lot of self-hatred and depression over leaving, especially if you leave others behind. I hope if anyone else can relate to this, this is the kick you need to leave. There's no shame in just disappearing if you're in a dangerous situation like I was. Story 49. My father was an alcoholic, addict, and abused my mom. There were several times we jumped in the car with suitcases and left, only to scramble back to the house before he got back from work. I was 6 years old, my brother's 3, when we finally left and stayed gone. I remembered pulling up to a house I'd never seen before, occupied by people I'd never met before. The couple rushed out and told my mom this was the right thing to do. She had to get out, etc. Later on, that first night when things were settled, my mom sat down with me to talk me through what was going on. She approached it like I imagine many parents do. It's not your fault. Sometimes people grow apart, etc. Here was the watershed moment. I told her I understood why we left. I understood my dad was beyond just not being a nice guy and that he was dangerous. This man was supposed to be a role model, my hero. Instead, by 6 years old, I understood he was the biggest threat to me, my mom, and my brothers. I grew up without a father, but I never regretted it a single day. And honestly, I thought I understood how bad a father he was until I had a son of my own. When I look at my son, I can't fathom how it was possible for him to be that way. I guess in the end, my dad did become a role model for me in exactly the person, husband, and father I should not be. Story 50. When I was 15 to 16, AOL was just picking up speed. Pun intended. 56K is what we had. All the chat rooms were horrible with people trying to exploit. Yes, I understand it hasn't really changed, except now people typically aren't as vulnerable as back then. This was also when about every house had a house phone and long-distance calls were expensive unless you used one of those 1010-811 numbers for like 10 cents a minute. Unlimited didn't exist yet. Well, I got sucked into talking to someone that turned into me calling her. First, a little enough to not be noticed, then a lot. 10 cents adds up quick. In the course of a month, I gave my parents an $800 phone bill and my dad's friend a $600 phone bill. I babysat his 3 kids. I panicked and moved in with the girl and her family 6 states away. Because of the number, they were able to get the police to look for me at their house, but they hid me. It took me 2 years before I called back home. They were so happy to hear from me that they called it a wash and just wanted me back. So, in a single night, I packed all my stuff and left that girl, that I didn't want to be with, without saying anything. I left like it was just another day going to work. Every now and again, my parents harass me about the bill I left them, but they're much happier that I'm back. Okay, what? This doesn't even feel like it's real. So, you panicked and you ran away from home because you ran up a phone bill, and then you stayed with a stranger for 2 years, and they allowed it, and then you just decided one day to up and leave and go back home? I think I read that right. Did I miss something? If I missed something here, please comment down below. Story 51. When I was 7 years old, I'm now 40, my mom sent me to the store to get her smokes. She knew the gas station attendant as it was a small Saskatchewan country town, which was why I was allowed to. She worked as a manager of the main local bar, so she knew all the crappy people in town. I went to the place and got them, and it was near the edge of town. I decided to just keep going as I wanted to see my grandma. My mom had an abusive boyfriend, so I wasn't very happy in my life and often wanted to go live with my grandmother. I managed to ride my little bike along the highway 2 towns over, which was about 40 to 50 kilometers before I got a flat tire and had to ask family for help. They took me in and fed me supper and called my mom. She was more impressed with how far I made it, more than she was angry with me, both not bringing back her smokes nor riding off. During my trip, I even got stopped by a police officer, and I just pointed to the closest farm and said I had just rode out from there and was just turning back. I got a flat tire because it was a warm summer day and the road was quite hot, and it was approximately 300 kilometers to my grandma's house. There had been some previous wandered-off moments when I was 4 and 5 years old. I realize now how lucky it was that I didn't just disappear. Story 52. I left my mother's house under the pretense of going out to look for work at 18. I jumped into a friend's car with whatever I could put into one bag to not look too suspicious and left. Before this had been months of fighting and arguments. My mom was wanting me to find work, which is fair, and I was trying. However, she was convinced that the only way to do it was going out and approaching businesses face to face. She would expect me to be out of the house at 9 a.m. sharp and not be allowed home before 9 p.m. This continued for about a month before I was too broke to continue using the train lines or eating outside the house. She refused to help in any way. She just told me to get out from 9 till 9 and find a job. My brother, who was 19, had no such requirement and spent most of his time at home playing video games. 90% of the places I went to would refuse to see me and tell me to apply online, so I'd go to the local library and max out the time I could spend on their computers to do so. It still didn't get anywhere close to the 12-hour time limit. Eventually, I started messaging a friend in a town 3 hours away about the situation, and he spoke to his mom, who offered to let me stay with them for a while instead. I packed what I could into a bag, did the typical morning ritual of eating breakfast in silence, and walked out. It wasn't until 2 days later that I started getting messages on my phone asking where I was. I just replied that I'd left, then I pulled the SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half, and threw it away. Just in case she contacted police, she had in the past when I was 20 minutes late getting home due to a late train. I contacted the local police station where I was living and the one where she lived, explaining the situation and that I was safe but had to leave. That was 7 years ago, and I've had minimal contact with my family since then, and have been mostly happier for it. Story 53. Neither did I go out for a pack of cigarettes, but in late 2012, my mom had been dating this guy for a while, which seemed to be the dream man. I was 15 at the time. Everything about this guy was perfect, and he even said that he would jam bass with me. I'm a guitarist, so this was how I was persuaded. My mother was struggling with rent and providing for us alone, so my twin brother and I didn't even have to think before saying yes because we saw how happy she was with him. So we moved into his house shortly after. The first couple of weeks were great. We were introduced to his kids, who were 8 and 11. Little did we know that the next 5 years were going to be our worst nightmare. We had to watch our mother being mentally abused, and when he didn't like something his own kids did, he took it out on me and my brother. This was pure narcissism, pure evil. I was the black sheep most of the time, so I spent as little time as home as I possibly could as a breathing room for the verbal abuse. He even cut my internet access when he didn't get his way. I couldn't take friends home or come home late at night because that would mean I was locked out. I didn't get a key. My mom called for a divorce 5 times, but he always convinced her to stay by switching to his romantic persona. But after he had his grasp over and over again, the mental abuse always continued. There was simply no way to stop it. Years go by, and honestly, I cannot remember much of it because I was already like a zombie, a punching bag for venting. My brother had moved to our uncle at this point, so now it was only my mother and I. The day came in fall of 2017, where she simply wouldn't be fooled anymore. My mother was home alone. She packed boxes with our stuff, and he comes home in the middle of it. He realizes that this time she's not joking because he had never actually seen her packing before. So he pushes her up to the wall and threatens her with, "If you take any of my stuff, you'll see what happens," and spits on her. She takes up her phone and pretends to call my brother. He then runs away and drives somewhere. He doesn't come back. My mom barricaded the door so that it would take longer for him to enter if he gets back and possibly hurt her. That way she can call for help. She continues to pack our stuff the whole night. He didn't come back. The day after, she calls our grandma and a friend to help pack, then drive all the stuff to a temporary storage. He then sends her a text that he's on his way home, and my mom quickly replies, "My mom, grandma, and friend is here." He hates our grandma, so he responds, "Okay, I'll be home later then." After they finish packing, my mother gives me a call and tells me what happened. She hadn't told me about what happened last night because she didn't want me to worry and get hurt if he came back. At this point, I'm at the house within the hour and help load the stuff into the car. Then we drove away. This was the day we escaped. When he eventually came home to see that we were gone, we had weeks of phone terror. He didn't know where we were at, but if he did, he would likely find us and threaten us. Story 54. My husband's mom did this. Perhaps she married too young. She left the kids, 3, to be raised by her Vietnam vet husband, Dad, that found work in the local coal mine once he returned stateside. My husband, 14 at the time, BIL 16, and little sister 10. So many mommy issues. My BIL finally got his crap together and is thriving. My husband, after working his tail off from childhood to retirement, is now circling the hole into alcoholism. It's as if he can finally let go of the reins of wild, tethered horses and feels like it's his very late spring break. Little sister started using drugs very early, became a maniac, lost all her kids, is now trying to reconnect. As far as MIL, she lives in a public housing project. Lost a leg through self-neglect and drug abuse. The thing that crushes me is when my husband tells me he loves me. It happens several times every day. It's not a declarative statement, it's plaintive. It breaks my heart and makes me despise his mother more. When she drops dead, we've agreed to cremate her and throw a party, because F you, Sherry, worthless piece of crap. Story 55. My mom left my abusive biological father, I really hate that word, I like to just call him Steve, when I was 18 months old. It was her weekend with us and basically we left and never came back. She had just met my dad, stepdad I guess, but I've never referred to him this way because he's the only father I know. She pretty much had to leave the state in the middle of the night. He would ransack our home and beat the living crap out of her. He threatened to take me and my 2 sisters from her if he ever got the chance, and she would never see us again. So she left the state with my dad. She technically could have gone to jail, but he was too lost in a can of beer to even care. We moved around so much for my dad's job, and she never had her name in the telephone book out of fear he would find us. Every time we went to visit our family in the state we came from, we were always in fear he would find us. Fast forward 18 years. When my parents got divorced, he finally sobered up enough to look in the phone book and found my mom's number. He called us and I spoke to him for the first time ever. I didn't want anything to do with him for what he put her through. I only talked to him once, and then last year, when my oldest sister passed away, I called him. I don't know what possessed me to do it. I figured he needed to know. My oldest sister attempted to have a relationship with him at one point, and actually before she passed wanted to reconnect with him. One of his daughters was no longer here. It would be interesting to hear his side of the story, and maybe one day I'll care enough to find out. But my feelings just aren't there yet, and not sure they ever will be. My mom is the strongest person I know. She risked it all to protect us from a maniac, and for that, I am truly grateful. Story 56. My daughter was 3 months old, and I was living in a situation where it was getting a bit unsafe for us. Him being aggressive and throwing things across the room, though he never touched me. And I had to make a choice to leave and be careful about it. One night, he came home from work and started yelling about that I didn't clean the floor properly and threw my daughter's baby carrier directly at me and her missing her by a couple inches, then said he was going to his brother's to pick something up and left. I texted him and told him I was going to the shops to get dinner. Within half an hour, grabbed whatever I could quickly and the baby and drove to my mom's and never went back. I texted and said we won't be returning. I was worried if I ever tried to leave when he was home, he might try and hurt me and try and stop me and do something to our daughter. I didn't tell him where we were, and I moved around for a bit the first week. I literally left with nothing but our essentials. I couldn't even go back to get my photo albums or personal stuff, and out of spite, he burnt all my belongings the week after I left anyway. It was the start of a crazy legal battle, though after I left with him, actually attempting to kill my daughter and I over the sale of our property we owned together, but that's another story. But it also made me realize it would have become way worse if I had stayed. Happy ending though. My daughter and I are doing great many years later. I got full custody pretty much straight away. He wanted nothing to do with her after I left. And we have lived a full, free life in different countries with lots of travel and lots of love between me and her. Story 57. I was in an abusive marriage. He never laid a hand on me, but he cheated on me with every single woman around him, including my friends. I was blinded for love. He was my first love. I was 14 when we started dating. I got pregnant at 16 and 17, and he forced me to have an abortion because I was so young. Truth was, he was an adult at the time, and if I had that baby, he would have ended in jail. We come clean to my family on my 18th birthday and got married when I was 21. He was the perfect husband, but ended up having some real problems with keeping his chicken in his pants, working too much, and alcohol. About 2 years before we broke up, I got pregnant and he told me it wasn't his. I asked for a DNA test to prove him it was. But we ordered the scans too early in the pregnancy and miscarriage. He, of course, felt guilty when the DNA came back positive, but it was too late. Around the same time, I discovered he was cheating on me. That wasn't the first time, but it was the first time I found out. Then he started screaming and punching the walls and throwing things up in the air in every argument. Once he told me he was going to see his mom upstate, and I found out, thanks to Instagram, that he was out in a movie festival with a student. I took my chance, told him I was going to the East Coast where my mom was working to visit her, since he was visiting his. I changed the locks and passwords, packed his stuff, sent it to his friends, and filed for divorce, and the next day I moved to London. 2 years after that, I keep adding names to the list of women he cheated on with. But now I don't care. I found happiness and a growing family with a wonderful guy. Story 58. I don't know if this technically qualifies, but here's my story. Last year, I left my abusive husband for good. We had 2 little ones, and I was 5 months pregnant at the time. He had been physically abusive towards me just a couple weeks prior to me leaving, and the last argument we had, he told me it would be better if I unalived myself since I was a effing nuisance to our family. Something in me broke that day, and I ended up calling 911. The cop that showed up advised me to get a divorce and a restraining order. Thankfully, our kids were with my mom during this time, and I ended up staying with them at my aunt's house that night. My husband tried calling and texting me, saying a bunch of BS about how we could fix things, but I went to the courthouse the very next day and got the restraining order. The cops went to our apartment while I was in the parking lot and served him with the papers, and he had to leave right then and there. I went back a few days later, packed up all mine and the kids' things, and moved out. I never took my kids back to the apartment, and I still don't know if that was the right thing to do. I didn't want them to have the heartache of seeing their empty room and knowing that we were never going to live there together as a family again. A lot has happened since then. My husband began a serious relationship with someone else when I was 9 months pregnant. I filed for divorce a few days before giving birth, and I had the most amazing and beautiful baby anyone could ask for. Leaving suddenly was the best decision I've made in my life. It literally saved me and my kids. Although things haven't been easy, I wake up knowing I'm capable of doing anything I want to accomplish. I'm alive and I'm free. My kids also have the opportunity of growing up in an abuse-free environment where they're encouraged to be themselves. Story 59. The following is a combined account piecing details from my own memory, and the accounts is remembered from some of my siblings concerning our abrupt departure from our family home. My father was physically and psychologically abusive to my mother and to a select few of his 10 children, of which I'm the 5th. He was giddily intimidating and notoriously controlling. My mother put up with it for far too long on the grounds that she was raised as ultra-conservative Catholic and refused to consider divorce. Our circumstances were that of abject poverty in an Appalachian region in which such was, and is, not uncommon. In the final year or so of our living there, things were getting pretty bad, and my mother frequently mentioned a wish to pack us up and move to California to be with her family. Not a divorce, but a permanent separation. Though this seemed an impossible and unlikely idle threat, as just the very idea of a single parent with no income moving 10 children, including a newborn, was laughable. By this time, my father was a few years into an affair with a married woman from a neighboring town, and he would often disappear for several days at a time to be with her. When he left, he would remove the microphone element from the telephone, without my mother's knowledge, so that if she attempted to make calls out, to distant family for instance, she would be able to hear them, and yet not understand why they could not hear her. During these times, we would be left home with no transportation, no money, and no groceries to feed my mother and, what were at the time, 9 children. Occasionally he would return after several days, magically carrying a bag of groceries, and our ignorant selves would celebrate him as the savior of the day. He would also occasion to bring his girlfriend to visit and show her off to his wife, flaunting his catch, so to speak. She was a tall, beautiful woman of grace and poise from a well-to-do lifestyle, and who lived in a large, beautiful home. As stupid children, we were mystified by her, without much awareness of the real circumstances. My father even took my brother and I to her house to play with her sons, and I remember being astounded by what seemed like a Santa's workshop of amazing toys I'd never seen before. As his disappearances became longer and more frequent, my mother took a night job, carrying a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. She walked a few nights each week to the other end of the holler where she could hitch a ride across the river on the back of a friend's motorcycle, so she could work all night mopping floors in 2 supermarkets before coming home at dawn to see us off to school, all while pregnant with my youngest sister, her 10th child. She did this to make a little emergency money to keep us fed. And then, one day, after my youngest sister was born, my father made the mistake of bringing his girlfriend to the house to show off the new baby. It turned out that he had been stringing her along under the premise that he and my mother no longer had any form of an intimate relationship, not for a long time, and that he only stayed with her to support the children, and that it was a mutual agreement between my parents that an intimate physical relationship was not a factor in their marriage. This also served to make him look like a saint in her eyes. Seeing that my father now had a newborn baby, she realized he had been lying to her, and she threatened to cut off the relationship unless he left my mother for good. She was still with her own husband and family, but was prepared to leave them to be with my father. This put my father at an unfamiliar disadvantage, as he no longer felt in control of the circumstances. And then an idea hit him. Not long before this, a neighboring house had burned down. There is evidence after the fact that it was intentionally set. That family received a decent insurance payout, and they were able to move out of the area. Soon afterward, my father began tampering with the basement furnace in order to set up a delayed furnace fire so that it would ignite while he was away with his girlfriend. My mother awoke in the middle of the night due to extreme heat, making the air almost unbreathable. She went down to the furnace area to see what was wrong, and she realized that my father seemed to have tampered with the furnace, and she told him this when he returned home the next day, behaving strangely. I should add that he was selling life insurance at the time. My mother put two and two together and started negotiating use of a telephone at a neighboring home to coordinate with her siblings a possible escape plan to get herself and her 10 children safely out of the area without my father knowing. A short time later, my mother again woke in the middle of the night, this time to a smoke-filled house and flames coming through the floor above the basement furnace, with what appeared a second attempt to burn down the house while the family slept. She quickly evacuated all the children and ran back into the home to pour buckets of water into the furnace grate, successfully dousing the flames and possibly destroying the furnace. My father was nowhere to be seen, having again left for the night. He drove into the driveway very early in the morning to find us outside as the house was being aired, again behaving strangely, possibly having expected a different circumstance. It could be argued that he was in shock at having nearly lost his home and entire family to tragedy, but reason and collective memory suggests otherwise. Whatever plans going forward, my mother was able to negotiate. She kept it a secret from us children. We were ignorant and untrustworthy in this regard. It had already been let slip that one of my siblings was excited about going to California, and my father often used this as a taunt, believing it would never come to fruition, particularly because he knew my mother was unable to use the phone. But then, one day, my mother told us to take our books and lunch boxes out of the book bags as we left for school, leaving the book bags behind. They were the only form of luggage we had available to us. As the dismissal bell rang that afternoon, our teachers collected my siblings and escorted us out to the schoolyard, where a large white truck with a camper shell awaited, driven by the same neighbor who had been motorcycling my mother to her night job. In the back of the truck, we found our book bags, stuffed with as many of our essential belongings as my mother could fit into them. Our teachers, having helped coordinate our escape, told us all goodbye, and we were driven directly to the airport, where we boarded a plane heading west. We landed late at night in California, still wearing our school uniforms. 44 years later, I still haven't been back. Story 60. Yeah, I was in a crappy relationship with this chick who was just unbelievably emotionally and physically abusive. And one morning, as I was leaving for work, she told me she hoped I got hit by a bus and didn't come home. I rung one of my good mates and organized to come crash on his couch after work, and he put me up for a while until I found a new place. I gave her exactly what she asked for and just didn't go back home. Bought myself a few changes of clothes and then went back and got some more of my stuff about a week later when I knew she wasn't home. It was pretty tough giving up most of my possessions, and I really did love her, but when she started messaging me asking when I was going to come back home, she refused to even acknowledge, let alone apologize, about the fact that she told me she hoped I died that day, which made me sure I'd made the right decision. I can't even remember what we were fighting about, but we were both drug addicts at the time. I'm a year clean now. She isn't. So I can guarantee it would have been something dumb and trivial, as it always was. We had a similar argument one day when I got a perfectly normal haircut she didn't like. To give you an idea of how silly some of the things she would decide she hated me over were. Long story short, I had myself fooled into believing that the relationship I was in was okay, but one day it got too much and I just gapped it. Since then, my life has improved immensely. Story 61. I left about 6 months after turning 18. I had met a boy, spoken to him for a week, told him literally everything, and he had mentioned that my home life was terrible. I had been entertaining the idea of just up and leaving my emotionally abusive mother and my enabling father for years at that stage, but having someone confirm my thinking was mind-blowing at that point in my life. I finally met the boy, and we got along so well that I lost track of time. 5 hours had turned into 9. I messaged my father and apologized, explained the situation, and he never responded. We drove back to my home for me to be greeted by my sister holding a backpack of essentials and telling me she was about to drop it at the door and leave me to fend for myself, that my parents were furious and that I was lucky they'd already gone to bed, that I had the balls to even show my face. Naturally, I believed her and decided the next day to live with my grandparents. I ended up spending 3 days with my grandparents before they decided that I had no choice but to go back and talk face to face if I were to continue living with them. I'd had no contact with my parents. They went out of their way to avoid me. My younger brother would go to my grandparents' house after school until my father could pick him up, but my mother began leaving work early to get him and take him to a friend's house for a few hours. And I didn't feel that they wanted to talk about anything, that they just wanted me gone. On day 3, my grandparents took my house key, told me not to come back unless I'd spoken to my parents face to face. I had been messaging the boy, trying to organize a time for us to meet again. I skipped classes at uni to see him, and ended up asking him for a massive favor. If I could either move in with him, or if he had a place I could live in until I got my own place. He had been told the whole situation, been kept up to date as things progressed, and accepted my request. I lived in his grandma's house for 6 weeks. It had been mostly abandoned for 2 years since she passed away. He kept me a secret from his family, wanted to keep me separate from his friends, and ended up finding us a place to stay. I got messages from my grandparents first. I told them I had found a place to go and that I was safe. My sister came next, and I told her the same thing. Never did I get a message from my parents until I asked if I could get some of my things. When I arrived, there was a giant pile of my things in the front yard. Leaves and sticks and bird poop in there as well, so I knew my things had been there for a while. My father cried, my sister glared, my mother was absent. I apologized a million times, but explained that this felt like the only option at the time, that I believed they hated me more than anyone else. Repeated exactly what my sister had told me. My father said she was wrong, that it was a complete lie, and that when he got home the day after the confrontation with my sister, he was going to talk to me about moving into my own place, that he thought it would help my relationship with him and my mother. It's been 2 years. I've had minimal contact with either of them, and after receiving videos from my brother of him telling me he hopes I never come back, that he hates me, he wishes I wasn't his sister, and them having my dog put down without telling me, I don't see a reason to get in contact again. I have all I need, and I'm doing okay. Okay, gotta draw the line at the dog getting put down. What the hell? Like, that's absolutely sick. That's absolutely disgusting. What is wrong with people? Moving on. Story 62. I was dating a girl I thought I'd get married to. I was a senior in high school, and she was going to a nearby private college. I'd drive down, we'd hang out, hook up, get pizza, and it was honestly great. Aside from one thing, she previously hooked up with one of my best friends while we were halfway dating 2 to 3 years prior. Not all the way, but rounding third, if you feel me. He knew I liked her. She was hot. He didn't care. I'm not even sure what went through her mind in retrospect, but I recently gained some insight. See later. In all fairness, humans make mistakes. I've made plenty in relationships since this experience, and I've also forgiven her. One day out of the blue, she says something like, "It wasn't his fault that I gave him a BJ multiple times behind your back, LOL. I truly don't remember anything up until that point, but I remember what happened after. I got up, said F you, and left. We had been dating for a couple years, and I just walked out and drove home. Later, she texted something like, "That's it?" And frankly, yes, it was. She was at college. I had no reason to see her again, so I didn't. We stopped talking, and I didn't see her for a few years. 3 years ago, which was 4 years after the incident for anyone who's keeping a timeline of my rambling history, she messaged me out of the blue. My memory of her was no longer negative. I just didn't care. In fact, I owe her for a lot of my personal growth while we were dating. I think that's normal, but it's nice to know and feel I was past it. So, being recently broken up with and devastated, I took her up on an offer to meet up. Well, we hung out a lot, went on dates, and even one night on the phone with her friends, she brings up how her mom asked if we were dating again. Drunkenly, she says, "Should we date again?" While the answer wasn't yes officially because of our history, my friends, mostly her being drunk and not serious in the moment, and my ex making the situation insanely complicated, we never really talked about it. All of a sudden, I found out she's been going on dates with other guys. It wasn't a big deal since we weren't serious yet, but I was hooking up with someone who was still going on dates with other men. I tried to get used to the idea of dating someone who was dating other men, but eventually, specific situations, inviting a Tinder date to meet me, her, and one of her friends at the bar, made it impossible, and a phone call with an ultimatum on my end ended whatever we had. So the insight was that until things are extremely specific, dating to her means any number of guys can be in the picture. In some ways I get it, but for the most part, our specific circumstances made it effed up both times. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. This has been a little cathartic to share today since my second ex in the story and I also started dating again after this ex I talked about, and we recently broke up again. I've been in a dark place, but realizing how past one of them I am helps me believe I'll be able to move on again eventually, just like before. Story 63. Forgive my spacing and stuff, I'm on the phone. I was 11 when my mom did it. She had been abused by her father for the better part of her life, and she married my dad to get away from her home. My dad was an a-hole too, and they fought constantly. She started cheating around the time the internet and online chat rooms really started to pick up. The summer of my 11th year, she told my dad and my sisters and myself that she needed to go away for a while to get help for her mental problems. The plan was for her to be away for 3 weeks at the mental hospital nearby. We were not allowed to visit as it would mess with the progress or something like that. So she shipped up to my grand's, and after about a week of us being there, my dad calls and says my mom had actually ran away to Utah with some dude from the internet. She was 31 at the time. He was 23 and no kids. My dad brought us back home, and I remember calling my mom multiple times after we finally got a number for her, and she kept saying she couldn't come back, for some reason or another, always making excuses. Then, about 8 months later, she comes back to work on the marriage. Nope. She starts a fight with my dad while us kids were all outside playing, then runs to the neighbors saying my dad beat her. She takes my sisters and I to a woman's shelter, and we were there for 2 weeks. I snuck back to our neighborhood to see my best friend, and my dad found out. He found me and we talked. I learned the truth and I said I wanted to live with him. My mom didn't waste any time. She snuck out of the country with my older and younger sister, back to Utah and him. He was basically waiting the whole time for her to come back with all of her girls. I didn't find out that they left for a whole week. The story is much longer after that, but that's the gist of it basically. My mom and I, our relationship, struggled for many years, and we finally are in a great place now. I do love her and understand a lot of what she did. I just wish she had done it differently, for all our sake. Oh, and she did end up marrying that guy. He was my stepdad for almost 20 years, but sadly he passed away 4 years ago. Freak accident, falling down the stairs while home alone. I miss him greatly. Story 64. I moved in with a random woman who was renting a room out on Craigslist because I really needed a temporary place to stay while I wasn't making much money and it was cheap and she wasn't asking for a deposit. It was okay at first, but she started to come on to me. I was 27, she was 40, and not the hot kind of 40. I didn't mind too much at first. I let her know I wasn't into it and didn't want to make our living situation awkward, but she started to act crazy and doing things like coming into my bathroom while I was showering and trying to get in with me, getting in bed with me while I was sleeping and touching me. She thought it was funny. I worked late and had a dog, so not sleeping there wasn't really an option. She would get drunk and act out like a child regularly, and then the straw that broke the camel's back was when I came home to my room trashed and my clothes taken out of my closet and thrown around my room. When I confronted her, she said it was her house and she could do whatever the F she wanted. I called my buddy and he said to come live with him and crash on his couch, and threw all my stuff in the back of his truck and was out of there before she got home. She tried to blow my phone up, but I blocked her number after the third message. I ended up taking over my buddy's lease and lived in his house for the next 5 years. Story 65. Not particularly the same walked out for a pack of cigarettes story, but my father decided, after marrying my mother and having 4 children with her, that a good idea was to cheat. He had received a job invitation in a different country and moved all of us there only to have an affair with a woman at his work. He got us all up out of bed one night and demanded to know who we'd choose to be with, meaning he wanted us to choose if we wanted to live with him or our mother. My brother and I were so young that we thought that night was a dream for so long. It was only until about 10 years later our sisters who remember it better brought it up. My mother moved us all back to our home country and left my father there. He then secretly married his mistress, only again to then cheat on her with another woman at a different work, divorced the first mistress to marry the second, still waiting on his unfaithfulness to arise again. As for what happened to us, my eldest sister remembers the most of it. I think that's why she's so damaged. In her teens, she hung around with the wrong crowd. The typical underage drinking, underage smoking, underage drugs, underage sex, underage abortion. Her anger knows no bounds, even today. One really vivid thing I remember about her and her anger is that she got into an argument with my brother, held him down, and nearly bit his ear off. She was and still is so angry, she flips on a dime. We no longer speak, and she no longer speaks to my brother, too. My sister still entertains it, but every now and then, she decides to not talk to my mother and blame her for everything wrong in her life. The texts she sends my mother break her heart. My other sister is emotionally manipulative. She will lie at any conceivable moment. I think she lies because she wants to tell people what she thinks they want to hear. If she thinks you want to hear that the sky is pink, she'll tell you, just to make you happy. She has never shown any wink of self-determination. She finished college only to come home, have a baby, and work at a supermarket. I love her so much, which is sometimes a cloud over her faults, but she lies for the best intentions. My father never wanted a second child, and my sister was never loved by him. Even till this day, he calls to tell me how she only had a baby because my eldest sister had a baby. She went into the same job as my father to please him, only for him to say at her graduation ceremony that she wasted her time and, quote, a professional kitchen is no place for a woman. My brother tried for so long to be the strong, silent type. I remember one day when he was in his teens, it was like a light went off in his head. He really wasn't the same. It's almost like he realized that his own father abandoned him, left him to fend for himself. I think my brother felt the weight of responsibility for me. He has always been, and always will be, one of the men that raised me. He took on that supporting role. More recently, my father leaving has bubbled up for him. Months of therapy, signed off at work. He does a particularly macho job, so being mentally ill doesn't exist. He finally told me a few months ago that he hates our father and wishes he saw our stepfather more like a dad when he was younger. But he's actually doing a lot better now. Wife, dog, house, and the next thing he needs is a baby. As for me, years and years of anxiety around people. I tend to think that they're lying to me, that my friends aren't my friends. They think I'm a big joke. They only hang around with me to laugh at me behind my back. I had 6 months of therapy about a year ago, which really helped. I finally learned to say that. My dad wasn't a good dad, and it's okay to say that. I really try not to argue with my partner as I'm worried he'll leave, just like my father did. I'll be graduating soon. I told my father some months ago so he could have time to book tickets to fly over. He told me he has no money. He and his wife both work full-time senior positions, have no other children, just 2 cats and a dog, and that it's too short notice. My degree was 4 years long. I set myself up for him to come through for me. I will and still give him every opportunity for him to be my father, and I've never been pleasantly surprised. It's like a big well of disappointment that sits in my head when I think about my father. I just can't stop trying to drink from it. To summarize, my father should have left and never came back. I think him being in and out of our lives has been so hard. We would have just rather felt abandonment than abandonment, fake love, fake compassion, long-distance phone calls about the weather, a constant feeling or need to please, and condescending conversations about how we could all do more as children to talk to him and make an effort with him. I feel guilty calling my stepfather dad because he isn't your dad, but he certainly is the man that raised me. That taught me and was patient, loving, kind, funny, and he showed me what a real father should be and what a real man is. Anyone can have kids. It takes a real man to be a father.